Enoch was not a man of idle nights. His sleep was a country he traversed with a strange familiarity, a landscape of corridors and thresholds that felt as real to him as the clay under his feet. Even when he nodded off by the hearth, those who watched would whisper that he had left the room entirely, stepping through a gate of mist into somewhere the waking could not follow. The stories that came from him were hushed at first, offered like fragments of a map, as if he carried the world of dreams sewn into the lining of his robe. Anyone listening closely could sense that these nights were not merely private visions but passages of knowledge, routes that threaded heaven and earth together through the act of dreaming itself. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you've ever felt that strange pull between sleep and something greater, like Enoch walking through dreams that feel more real than the world itself. When he began to speak of the dream gates of heaven, his voice took on the cadence of one walking ancient halls, a slow footfall that measured time in breaths. He described gates not as doors in wood or metal, but as living thresholds, places where the air itself shimmered with invitation and caution. Some were small, no wider than a man, folding like the palm of a closed hand. Others opened like valleys, allowing Enoch to see rivers of light and hosts of beings moving in patterns that resembled woven cloth. Each gate required a petition of the heart and a certain attunement of intent, a willingness to let the self unravel and reassemble on the other side. The first gate he spoke of was simple in appearance, an arch of dew and root resting in a grove where night and day conversed. Passing through it felt like stepping inside a held breath, an experience of sudden silence and aperture, the kind that makes one aware of listening as an act. On the other side, Enoch found a field of letters, not written on parchment, but suspended in the air like seeds waiting to sprout, each one an idea with weight and texture. He learned there that language in the higher registers is not merely communicative, it is creative, shaping the very soil from which future worlds would grow. Moving from that field, he encountered a gate veined with ice that hummed when touched, producing tones that seemed to alter time itself. The ice did not sting, but rather clarified, cutting through the fog of habitual thought and revealing the architecture beneath decisions and the scaffolding of memory. Enoch would describe how time in that realm was elastic. Moments could be kneaded like dough, stretched to examine a single choice from countless angles, then folded back into continuity. He returned from such journeys bearing the uncanny ability to recall not just what had happened, but what might have been, and in that recalling there was a kind of remedial mercy for those he loved. Another gate was less a gate than a threshold of faces, a congregation of eyes that watched as if they were anchors for truth. Passing required that Enoch present a name, not always one he had been given at birth, but one he had earned in childhood trials and in silent promises. Names, he learned, carried a gravity, they called forth patterns of fate and invited correspondences across the heavens. To utter a true name before those watchful faces was to make oneself known in a language older than counties and borders, and to be known in such a way was both safe and perilous. In the gate of rivers he found water that flowed toward meaning rather than sea, currents that carried fragments of histories and futures like leaves. The water there remembered things with an intimacy that made Enoch both comforted and unsettled, because remembrance was not neutral, it shaped identity. Standing in that stream, he watched recollections swirl into new configurations, creating images that taught him how stories are riverbeds that guide the course of nations and hearts. When he emerged, he spoke of recollection as an element, a primary to be tended like fire or air, something that must be kept clean lest it become muddied and breed falsehood. There was a gate that smelled of old ink and opened onto a library of winds, each shelf a current that carried voices and the aromas of distant rooms. In that space, knowledge was not static, it breathed and paced like a restless bird, eager to migrate and change in accordance with whom it touched. Enoch would sit in the gusts listening to doctrines rearrange themselves into parables, gaining a new appreciation for how doctrine could be salvage and also cage. He learned that books could be companions or prisons and that the sacred task was discerning when to read and when to be read. At a gate that appeared as a ring of stone engraved with tiny galaxies, Enoch was shown the craft of pattern making, the geometry of compassion. The stones hummed in a language of angles, and he saw how acts of mercy made distinctive forms in the celestial fabric, stars aligning in sympathy whenever kindness was shown. This gate suggested that the heavens were responsive lattices, where small gestures could resonate outward with proportional elegance. It made him careful in public and private, aware of the ripple of his hands and the trajectory of his silence. Sometimes the gates were guarded by beings who looked like ordinary farmers, or midwives, or traders, all of them wearing ordinary garb with eyes that held an impossible depth. These guardians asked of Enoch not theological riddles but ordinary kindnesses, to pick the lost cotton from a stranger's cloak, to return a child's toy to its place, to speak truth where rumor had spread like mold. It was through such simple acts that he proved worthy to proceed, for the gates tested not knowledge but the ethical fiber of the traveler. Their lesson was perpetual. Heaven is attentive to the measure of a man's hands, and thresholds favor those who have labored humbly. There was a gate of silence that admitted Enoch into a presence where even sound was a visible thing, coalescing into threads like the breath of a sleeping animal. Entering required that he disrobe his speech, laying down the need to explain, to rationalize, to justify. In that quiet, he heard the raw honesty of the universe, a cadence that did not require translation. It told of small mercies and the slow justice of seasons. He emerged with a mind uncluttered by the compulsion to comment, having learned that silence can be the most articulate sermon. The dream gates did not operate on a single axis. They were arranged like a choir, each voice distinct but participating in a larger harmony. Enoch learned to move between them not as a conquering hero but as a pilgrim, mindful of the order of approach, the etiquette of crossing thresholds. There was a rightness in sequence, a pedagogy to the gates, and to skip ahead without the proper attunement could result in visions that were as harmful as they were illuminating. He often compared the gates to musical keys, each unlocking a scale of perception that required practice and a respect for dissonance. On certain nights he found a gate made entirely of doors, a forest of hinged apertures that opened onto various scenes, a child's first discovery of snow, an empress pondering a single decision, a thief learning regret. Each door offered a fragment of a life, and Enoch would step through one and feel the presence of that other for a heartbeat, a borrowed empathy that returned to him altered. It taught him the elasticity of identity, how easily the self can be extended into another's suffering and thereby be enlarged. He held these borrowed states with a tenderness that sometimes left him shaken, because in holding them he implicitly agreed to care for what he had witnessed. There was a gate wreathed in smoke that smelled neither of fire nor of ruin but of memory softened by time, the scent of meals eaten in kitchens long since gone. Through that haze Enoch was granted visions of ancestral kitchens where old women folded dough and told stories to children who would carry those tales into obscure corners of the world. He saw how domestic labor was inextricably tied to continuity and how the unglamorous work of caring kept the world stitched together. The hush of those kitchens taught him to honor the small rituals that keep societies intact and to recognize them as holy in their quiet constancy. Among the gates was one that answered with mirrors, reflecting possibilities rather than confirmations. Those surfaces did not merely replicate a face, they showed the same person under different choices, each reflection an argument made by a life for a particular outcome. Enoch was often tempted by the seductive clarity of these images, but he learned restraint, realizing that peerless knowledge of every possible self can wither the will to act. He left this gate with the conviction that wisdom required both imagination and the courage to commit to one vision of living. There was a narrow gate whose staff ran like a river stone beneath the palm, rounded by time and touching only those who approached with intent rather than curiosity. Passing through demanded steadiness, a measured breath, for inside flowed currents of obligation and covenant, unseen threads binding persons across ages. In that flow, Enoch found contracts not written in ink but in promises exchanged in cramped rooms and under olive trees, promises that shaped families, towns, and empires. He came away with a deeper understanding of fidelity, seeing how oaths had weight and how a single broken promise could ripple outward into calamity. The dream gates sometimes offered instruction in forms that resembled apprenticeship. Enoch learned not only by revelation but by doing, by being taught to weave, to mix herbs, to balance accounts of mercy against those of strict justice. Teachers appeared in the guise of potters, smiths, and midwives, and in their hands were the tools of a humility that sanctified labor. In learning those crafts, he discovered that spiritual truth is often conveyed through craftsmanship, that the hand engaged in honest work is an instrument of revelation. These lessons humbled him, reminding him that heaven treasures earnest practice as much as ecstatic insight. A particularly grave gate was made of woven sorrow, a lattice of small laments and collective grief that, when entered, would catalog losses like a library organizes volumes. It asked of Enoch to stand inside and not to turn away, to count each sorrow as a star rather than a stone to be avoided. In that sorrow space he felt the sorrow of rivers being dammed, the grief of children without fathers, the slow dying of languages, and he found that understanding these pains was the prerequisite for any attempt to heal. He emerged with a resolve to bear witness, and with the knowledge that bearing witness itself can be a kind of healing. There was a gate that smelled of iron and olives, a place where battles were remembered with a surgeon's precision rather than the triumph of banners. Crossing it, Enoch saw the anatomy of conflict laid bare, the motives so meager that they could be held in one hand, the miscommunications that grow like rot when neglected, the cost in small humane things that wars obliterate. He slipped by that gate and woke with a pacifist's hunger, not merely for peace as an abstract, but for negotiated reconciliations, for the soft work of mending what violence tears. The gate taught him that true victory often looks like returning a stolen animal to its pasture. One gate breathed the scent of thunder and rainfall, an aperture into the laws of weather not as meteorology but as moral grammar. There, storms were interpretable as the sky's way of articulating limits and renewing boundaries, as if the elements themselves were engaged in a moral speech about excess and restraint. Enoch watched clouds conspire and disperse and understood that balance is maintained by cycles that are both punitive and restorative. He returned to his people with a new etiquette for listening to nature, recognizing the ethical language embedded in seasonality. Another gate was ringed with bells that chimed in tones corresponding to a soul's inner state, each note revealing an anatomical truth about desire and its consequences. Passing through required tuning, Enoch had to find pitches that resonated with his own inner architecture, and misalignment produced visions that were discordant and unsettling. Yet those dissonances proved instructive, teaching him how unchecked longing could morph into mania, and how disciplined hope could be a stabilizing music that held communities together. He learned to sing without dominating, to lead by tone rather than volume. There existed a gate that tasted of figs and salt, a sensual threshold reminding him that the body is never entirely divorced from the sacred. In that realm, appetites were not condemned wholesale but examined and redirected, like rivers guided into channels that served life and community. He met ascetics there who were not lifeless but luminous, people who had learned to harness appetite in ways that honored both body and spirit. From them Enoch absorbed a balanced ethic of pleasure and restraint, one that treated the body as a temple and the senses as faithful servants when properly trained. Some gates were tentative, a suggestion of passage rather than a full invitation, appearing at the edge of dreams like the liminal light of dawn on a distant horizon. Enoch found that he had to cultivate patience with those, waiting in the threshold until the gate finished its gestation. There was wisdom in waiting, he discovered, for some truths would only ripen in their season and clumsy insistence would bruise them. The patience taught by these hesitant gates became a discipline of its own, a quiet art of allowing revelation to come on its own timetable. There were gates of kinship, woven from the laughter and quarrels of families, where Enoch learned to read the unspoken contracts that hold households together. These passages revealed how lineage could be both lifeline and shackle, and how family stories can be embroidered with both pride and error. He saw how a single story told differently across generations could calcify into a myth that justified cruelty, and how another telling could redeem a lineage. Walking through these gates made him tender toward both tradition and reform, understanding that neither could stand alone without the other. At times the gates were locked by riddles that seemed designed to unpick ego. The answers were rarely clever but often embarrassingly simple. A riddle might ask why an old woman smiled when her crops failed, or why a child forgave an offender at dawn, demanding that Enoch look beyond spectacle to the commonplace seeds of grace. Solving such riddles required humility and observation, and their solutions often altered his moral compass more than any grand revelation. The riddles taught him that the extraordinary often hides within ordinary acts of virtue. Enoch also faced gates that reflected political structures, massive doors carved with the symbols of states and sovereignties, revealing the soul of governance. Entering these gates, he was shown the anatomy of power, how rulers are tempted by isolation, how counsel can be virtue or treachery, how laws can be instruments of liberation or chains of cruelty. He saw governments rise and fall like breath, and he learned how policy and prayer interact, how the sacred and the civic sometimes conspire toward justice and sometimes toward oppression. These visions shaped his convictions about leadership and accountability, making him wary of absolute authority and mindful of the need for institutions that remember mercy. Equally, there were gates that smelled of markets, a cacophony of haggling and barter that taught Enoch the moral physics of exchange. Here the vision was practical. Economies are moral systems as much as technical ones, and commerce can bless or impoverish souls depending on the rules and the stories it tells. He watched merchants who practiced fair measures prosper in ways that nourished their communities, and he observed traders who hoarded and lied only to corrupt the entire market. From this, he fashioned a theology of trade that insisted on fairness and transparency as forms of sacred stewardship. Some gates opened onto gardens where plants hummed with ancestral memory, each leaf holding a story of climate and culture. In this botanical cathedral, Enoch saw how species carried the histories of peoples, how certain seeds were repositories of resistance or of hope. He learned to tend those gardens like archivists, recognizing that preserving biodiversity is also preserving the memory of those who have walked before. The gardens taught him that stewardship of the land is a narrative practice, a way of narrating future survival through present care. There was a gate of contrition where sinners not only confessed but were taught how to make amends in ways that repaired relationships rather than simply easing conscience. Remedies there were embodied and restorative, requiring action that would rebalance rather than merely punish. Enoch observed rituals of reconciliation that demanded listening, restitution, and creative reparative measures that reknit the social fabric. He returned convinced that justice without restoration is only ritual, and that restoration without accountability collapses into false peace. A gate of mirrors of knowledge confronted him with the limits of human cognition, showing theories as scaffolds rather than absolute edifices. Enoch learned humility about knowing. The visions taught him that certainty can harden into dogma, and dogma into cruelty. He watched scholars gently dismantle their own theorems, making room for nuance and for the improbable truth that our best explanations are drafts awaiting correction. It taught him to prize inquiry over triumph and curiosity over certainty. There was a gate of labor where the work itself spoke, where plows and looms and anvils expressed truths through rhythm and repetition. Entering the gate felt like becoming an instrument, feeling wood, metal, and earth speak against skin and bone, and realizing the language that physical toil writes upon the soul. He sat with artisans who taught him that meaning is often made through repetitive, faithful practice, that vocation is not mere occupation but a medium through which the soul matures. He left that place with hands that remembered patterns, with a deeper reverence for people whose names are rarely celebrated. A delicate gate was woven from the laughter of children. It admitted him into a realm of imagination that refused adult skepticism. There he witnessed play that restructured reality, games that allowed for new forms of problem solving, and stories from children that bore truths adults sometimes missed. Enoch recognized that to dismiss childish imagination is to discard a method of truth-seeking that is not naive but inventive. This gate taught him that serious adults would do well to listen to the wisdom of play. There was a gate where dreams themselves nested within dreams, a hall of recursions in which each layer mirrored another and time folded like paper. Navigating that labyrinth required a steady center, or else one could be lost to infinite regress, an eternal exile of endless imaginations. Enoch developed practices of anchoring, recitations, breathings, small tactile tokens, to maintain selfhood amid multiplicity. From this he learned how to be present without being fragmented, how to hold many perspectives without dissolving into them. Sometimes the gates showed him futures sculpted by small choices, domino lines of consequence stretching faintly into the dim. He would watch a man choose kindness in a minor moment and see a future landscape brightened, or observe how a petty cruelty birthed generations of distrust. The lesson was relentless. Futures are not made only in spectacular acts, but mostly in tiny, accumulating habits. Enoch returned urging his community to cultivate modest virtues, for he had glimpsed how habits were the sinew of history. There was a gate of thresholds between life and death, an archway softened by mourning where ancestors walked like slow tides. Entering this gate was akin to being at a vigil, where the dead spoke not to terrify but to teach, offering counsel gathered from the long perspective of those who had seen eras rise and fall. The conversations felt like inheritance in speech form, filled with cautions about pride and invitations to stewardship. Enoch carried those counsels back like a torch, illuminating choices with ancestral light. A gate of mathematics and patterning revealed to Enoch the soul of proportion, the way beauty and justice often rested upon symmetry and balance. He saw how societies that valued proportion tended to distribute goods and burdens with fairness, and how those that prized distortion cultivated inequality. The visions made him attentive to the geometry of laws and the arithmetic of care, understanding that justice has spatial and numerical logic as much as moral sentiment. He returned with metaphors of scale and measure that he used to articulate thoughtful governance. There existed a gate that was a kind of theater of regret, where historical wrongs were acted out and then reimagined with reparative possibilities. Watching these performances, Enoch learned how creative retellings can transform shame into service, how those once complicit in cruelty might be redirected toward acts that rebuild. These were not mere fantasies. The rehearsals in that gate proposed practical pathways for restitution and structural healing. He left convinced that narrative renewal can be policy, and theatrical rehearsal can incubate real-world reform. At times a gate would collapse inward, offering no passage, teaching Enoch that not all questions are ripe for answers and not all doors are meant to be opened. These refusals were as instructive as the visions, forcing him to learn patience and respect for limits. There was humility in hearing a gate say no, a recognition that restraint is part of cosmic wisdom. He learned to accept boundaries without bitterness, understanding that some mysteries were preservations rather than denials. A gate shimmering like a mirage offered him glimpses of utopias, not as blueprints but as imaginative provocations, places where injustice had been abetted by unlikely practices. The visions revealed societies that prioritized listening, that routed resources to the vulnerable with elegance, and that had invented customs to remember the wronged. These were not idyllic without effort. They showed the discipline, the political craft, and the mundane daily commitments required to sustain fairness. Enoch took from these scenes a toolkit of hopeful possibilities married to sober strategies. There were gates that tested memory by arranging 1,000 little faces before him, asking him to name them and the debts owed to each. The exercise was maddening and humbling. It revealed how society neglects the intimate bookkeeping of care. Enoch found that remembering names and small obligations kept communities knit together, preventing the dissolution that occurs when people are rendered anonymous. From this he fashioned a practice of deliberate remembrance, an ethic of calling names aloud so obligations might be met. The gates sometimes taught him about music as a metaphysical technology, a way to align societies using rhythm, melody, and communal resonance. Enoch stood in halls where songs sorted out conflict, where chants healed broken relations, and where harmonies functioned like stitches closing a seam. He learned that music can be constitutive of social life, encoding values and enabling collective action with a force that reason alone cannot muster. He returned with hymns that carried practical instruction as well as consolation. One gate revealed the anatomy of love itself, not as romantic ideal but as a structural principle for social flourishing. Within it, Enoch saw love as a multifaceted practice that includes commitment, discipline, forgiveness, and delight. The vision dispelled the notion that love is only feeling. It showed that love is also a work of repair, a political strategy that undermines systems of exclusion by creating ties across difference. He emerged with a more capacious definition of love that could bear policy, family life, and friendship alike. There existed a gate where logic took on a physicality, lines of reason manifesting as bridges and ladders that could be traversed. In that space, Enoch watched thinkers walk their own proofs and sometimes tumble, learning the difference between argument tested by fire and argument performed for spectacle. He observed cognitive humility as a practiced way of building bridges that hold rather than ribbon bridges that collapse under weight. These visions refined his discernment, making him more skeptical of elegant arguments that lack ethical bearing. Another gate was a marketplace of apologies, where remorse was exchanged for practical redress and grudges were negotiated into new beginnings. Here the currency was not money but willingness to repair, and Enoch observed the transactions with fascination, noting how restorative economies could be built when parties committed to repair rather than punishment alone. The gate taught him how social debts can be reconciled in ways that restore dignity to both harmed and harmer. He returned from there as an advocate for processes that reweave trust rather than merely assign blame. There was a gate where language itself was retooled to be inclusive, where words were tested and revised until speech matched the worth of its objects. Enoch saw that words can be instruments of violence when carelessly used and instruments of healing when thoughtfully shaped. He watched workshops where old slurs were replaced with terms that recognized personhood, where metaphors were debated and chosen for their life-giving capacities. From this he learned that lexicon reforms are not trivial but are, in fact, creative acts with moral consequence. A gate of seasons taught him about cyclical memory, how time returns in patterns that can be anticipated and shaped. In that realm he saw economic policies crafted to account for droughts, celebrations timed to replenish exhausted spirits, and memorials scheduled to restore communal memory. The vision insisted that societies need ritual calendars to stabilize collective life and to provide predictable intervals of rest and renewal. Enoch went back to his people urging they plan with seasonality in mind, arguing that a polity without rhythms is a people without anchors. There was a gate where artisans of light taught him how to craft rituals that create community cohesion without erasing difference. The rituals were subtle and imaginative, employing food, song, and conjugations of greeting to weave strangers into daily friendship. These practices were theirs not to coerce but to invite, and Enoch learned how easy it is to mistake performance for transformation. Out of these visions he developed a praxis of ritual that honored diversity while forming common life. Enoch found a gate that was a map of grief, showing how sorrow can be navigated and not merely endured. The map offered pathways that led through remembrance, to reparative action, and into creative futures, insisting that health emerges when grief is tended collectively. The experience made him into a midwife of mourning, someone who could stand beside a community while it birthed new forms of hope from loss. He returned with liturgies for public sorrow that were practical, accessible, and ethically oriented. There was a gate composed of the small laws of hospitality, where even the placement of a cup could alter the politics of a room. In that space, Enoch observed exchange rituals designed to prevent violence and to build trust between strangers. He learned that hospitality is microdiplomacy, that how we receive others can be a principal method of forming alliances and of averting hostility. He took these customs home as pragmatic tools for peacekeeping in ordinary life. A Gate of Debt and Forgiveness examined the economic ethics of lending and mercy, showing how systems that refuse forgiveness calcify inequality. Enoch saw that a culture of perpetual debt creates structural unfreedom, and that carefully practiced forgiveness can break cycles of poverty. Yet he also learned the need for responsible lending and clear agreements, noticing how reckless generosity can enable irresponsibility. The gate taught him a nuanced approach, forgiveness coupled with structures that prevent exploitation. There existed a gate made of stories so old they had become part of the soil. Entering it, he felt the weight of narrative tradition pressing gently upon him. He was shown the way myths can both justify and challenge institutions, the manner in which stories instruct children and stabilize communities. Enoch learned to read these myths critically, extracting their moral cores and leaving behind the elements that perpetuated harm. He became a steward of stories, curating them for use rather than allowing their unexamined repetition to preserve injustice. One gate was an archive of craft and repair, where broken instruments were mended not by discarding parts but by integrating new materials to make them stronger. It taught Enoch that resilience is not restoration to a former state but an incorporation of loss into a sturdier whole. He watched communities repair not only objects but relationships, embedding lessons of failure into renewed structures. These practices reshaped his approach to rebuilding after disaster, favoring integrative repair over brittle restoration. A Gate of Silence and Testimony revealed the dynamics of listening as an ethical art. He learned that attentive silence can be a form of moral action. He watched tribunals where victims were heard without judgment, where listening itself functioned as validation and a step toward accountability. Enoch understood that silence can be complicit, but purposeful listening can be powerful and corrective. This reshaped how he engaged with conflict, prioritizing hearing as a form of service. Enoch encountered a gate where disappointment was transformed into prudent adaptation, a laboratory for learning where failure was documented and used to improve future attempts. It taught him how organizations can cultivate cultures of honest self-critique without demoralizing their members. The gate modeled a resilient ethos: learn quickly, forgive failure, and adapt systems so that repetition of harm is less likely. Enoch returned eager to implement these lessons in the councils and crafts of his community. There were gates that showed him the hidden liturgies of day-to-day life, the small rituals people enact to maintain sanity and dignity, like the tying of a scarf or the greeting of a neighbor. These tiny acts, taken together, formed a communal liturgy that no church wholly encompassed yet profoundly shaped social moralities. Enoch saw that attention to these small rituals could sustain ethics on a granular level, making large ideals practical. He began to teach that holiness grows as much in ordinary repetition as in extraordinary revelation. A Gate of Thresholds for Children showed him educational practices that cultivated curiosity without crushing imagination, teaching how to instruct without indoctrinating. He watched teachers who prized questions over rote answers, who created spaces for doubt as part of learning. Enoch learned that education can be liberatory when it equips learners to think and compassionate when it inculcates empathy. He returned with a pedagogy that cherished open inquiry and moral formation together. There was a gate shaped like a market of futures, where speculative scenarios were debated as civic experiments, each forecast tested against humility and ethical constraint. Here the community rehearsed futures responsibly, not to predict but to prepare, learning to govern by plausible anticipation rather than panic. Enoch saw how foresight becomes tyranny if uncoupled from democratic deliberation, and he advocated for anticipatory practices that remained inclusive and accountable. The gate taught him prudent imagination, the ability to dream responsibly about what might be. A gate braided with law and mercy showed how legal systems could be knitted to respond to human frailty rather than to abstract perfection. In that court, judges were trained in mercy as a discipline, and laws were crafted to be reparable and humane. Enoch watched sentences framed not merely to deter but to mend, to restore social capital rather than destroy it. He left with a renewed commitment to advocate for systems that balanced fairness with compassion. There was a gate where artists sculpted memory, making public monuments that honored truth without idolizing violence, creating spaces that invited reflection rather than triumphalism. Enoch saw how aesthetics could either conceal or reveal history, and he learned the ethical imperative to design public memory with care. The artists that taught him to imagine memorials that foreground restoration and learning, not just commemoration. He returned to his people with an eye for public spaces that could guide moral education across generations. One gate offered a vision of a council where elders and youth deliberated together, a model of intergenerational governance that preserved memory while embracing change. There he saw how elders could be repositories of wisdom without being fossilized, and how youth could be carriers of innovation without being reckless. Enoch learned that a polity's health depends upon institutions that respectfully translate experience into future-shaping practices. He became an advocate for councils that institutionalized both caution and courage. There were gates of thresholds for grief and celebration, teaching Enoch how to mark life cycles without collapsing into sentimentality or stoic repression. He witnessed rituals of birth and death that balanced sorrow and joy, integrating community care across transitions. These practices taught him how to construct public rites that bind rather than divide, offering templates for a society that witnesses life fully. He returned instructing others in rites that honored complexity instead of flattening it. A gate of hospitality toward strangers demonstrated the practical mechanics of welcome, places where strangers are fed, stories exchanged, and obligations recorded, forming networks of mutual aid. Enoch saw how such hospitality prevented dehumanization and created durable alliances across difference. He took these designs home, urging the formation of institutions that institutionalized welcome without exploiting it. The vision reoriented his understanding of neighborliness into a strategic ethic of social resilience. There was a gate where reason and imagination were wed, a workshop producing policies infused with narrative sensitivity, where logical coherence was married to humane instincts. In that space, he watched bureaucracies become humane when narrative imagination informed their designs, showing how policy can be both efficient and tender. He returned with a conviction that systems thinking must be laced with story, that empathy needs institutional scaffolding. This guided his later counsel to leaders who sought to balance efficiency with compassion. Enoch found a gate where the cosmos was folded like cloth, showing him how macrostructures and daily habits reflect and inform one another in a dance of scale. He saw how cosmic images can be used to teach moral structures and how small virtues echo in planetary well-being, as if ethics vibrates from the personal to the planetary. He learned to think in nested scales, tending household habits as if they were seeds of global culture. These visions turned his theological imagination toward praxis at every level of life. There was a gate where forgiveness and accountability were inseparable, where confessions were followed by practical amends and community reintegration processes. Enoch learned how to design rites that repaired trust, requiring both repentance and reparative labor. The vision emphasized that forgiveness is not a single event but a process embedded in social reality. He returned determined to promote accountable restoration rather than easy absolution. At times, gates opened not to teach but to grieve for lost possibilities, showing Enoch the roads not taken by civilizations that could have been humane. He mourned with those visions, learning that regret can be a form of political education if it prompts corrective action. Those images made him fiercely present to the obligation of repair and to the stubborn hope that the future can yet be shaped. He became a proponent of mourning that converted into mobilization. A gate of craft and healing put into his hands the knowledge of herbal and social remedies, medical practices paired with ethical frameworks that demanded dignity for patients. Here he watched healers who treated both bodily ailment and social conditions, recognizing the interdependence of health and social justice. Enoch absorbed a practice of healing that was holistic, combining hands-on medicine with advocacy for the structures that produce illness. He returned as a humble advocate for integrated care rooted in community. Enoch learned that real healing means caring for people and the world they live in. Subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you believe true healing starts with the hands that help or with the hearts that refuse to give up. There existed a gate where law and narrative were braided, teaching how storytelling can be constitutive of law, how precedents become sacred when narrativized. Enoch observed judges who told stories to explain rulings and legislators who crafted narratives to envision laws as humane instruments. This gate taught him to wield narrative responsibly, to recognize the line between justification and manipulation. He returned committed to juridical speech that clarifies and dignifies rather than obscures. A gate of civic imagination showed him how architecture, public spaces, and language could be designed to encourage trust rather than suspicion. He watched buildings that facilitated encounter and plazas that naturally hosted dialogue, seeing how design shapes social behavior. Enoch became convinced that city planning is moral work, a set of choices that either deepen isolation or invite belonging. He advocated for public spaces that are intentionally generous, creating room for democratic life to unfold. There was a gate of thresholds for judgment, where decisions were made in the light of communal testimony rather than alone in ivory chambers. Enoch observed juries that included varied voices and sentences framed after public reflection, not private decree. The vision promoted participatory justice as a method of cultivating responsibility and ownership in communities. He returned with a passion for decentralizing authority in ways that fostered shared moral labor. A gate offering images of reconciliation showed him how symbolic acts can transform relations when accompanied by structural changes, combining ceremony with policy. Enoch saw rituals that acknowledged harm and then restructured institutions to prevent recurrence. This coupling of symbolic and structural reform became a central insight, teaching him that apologies without change are hollow. He brought back a pragmatic theology of reconciliation, insisting on reforms that match rhetoric. There were gates that tested his courage by revealing the consequences of silence, presenting scenarios where failure to speak meant the difference between healing and harm. Enoch learned the disciplined art of prophetic speech, to name injustice bluntly, to do so with compassion, and to organize remedies rather than merely inveigh. The gate shaped his rhetorical practice, making him a speaker who measured truth against effect, preferring language that empowered change over language that simply scored rhetorical points. In a final series of thresholds, he met gates that were simply rest, places where revelation arrived like a friend sitting quietly, needing no fanfare. Those gates taught him the value of replenishment, that even a pilgrim of the heavens required seasons of repair. He learned to integrate rest into his vocation, treating it as part of ethical living, not as frivolous idleness. This ethic of rest became part of his counsel, advocating for rhythms that honor human limits as well as capacities. Across all these gates, Enoch carried a central lesson. Heaven is not a monolith but an ecology of thresholds, each contributing to a larger pedagogy of life. These gates shaped him into a teacher who could translate otherworldly experiences into practical instructions for living. He returned to his people with visions that were at once transcendent and fully integrated into the affairs of daily life, insisting that spiritual insight is validated by its capacity to reform the world. His counsel was both visionary and pragmatic, rooted in thresholds that teach, correct, and restore. The townsfolk who listened to Enoch found his descriptions at once bewildering and strangely familiar, as if his dream gates were revealing patterns they had always lived within but had never named. Some of his neighbors took comfort, reorganizing their days to match the ethics he described, while others met him with skepticism, wary of how dreams could unsettle social equilibrium. Enoch met both responses with patience. He knew that gates require invitation and that conviction grows from lived practice as much as from persuasive speech. He urged experiments, small rituals that tested the dream insights without demanding wholesale conversion. He taught apprentices how to approach gates with humility, training them in practices of breath, remembrance, and naming so they would not be overwhelmed by the vistas within. His methods were practical, walking exercises for steadiness, reading practices to integrate visions into daily counsel, and community rituals that channeled insights into public goods. Students often reported profound changes, not because they had seen the same heavens, but because they had learned to live with the kind of intention that those dream gates require. Enoch took these students gently, knowing that the gates are long and patient instructors. Over the years, his narratives gathered accretive detail, like sedimentary layers building a continent. Each retelling added practical measures, warnings, and exemplars drawn from life. He cataloged a lexicon of gate types, methods for approach, and guidelines for communal integration, producing a body of lore that functioned as a social technology. Communities that adopted these practices found new resilience in the face of crises and new appetite for imaginative governance. The dream gates thus moved from personal wonder to public resources, tested in markets, courts, and quiet kitchens. At times, skepticism hardened into opposition. Some accused Enoch of fabricating doors to justify personal counsel or to consolidate influence. In response, he did not argue from triumph, but from the testable fruit of his teachings, repaired relations, effective counsels, and restored public spaces that followed his advice. When his models failed, he was the first to admit error, humbly revising practices until they worked better in the messiness of human life. This humility reinforced his moral authority more than any spectacular claim could have done. Scholars later attempted to classify his gates, to map them into a system, but Enoch resisted turning the lived variety of thresholds into rigid taxonomy. He insisted that naming should aid navigation and not be a cage, that maps are tools but not masters. He allowed others to write treatises but insisted that the living practice of tending gates remain adaptive and hospitable to local culture. He remained a pilgrim, not a systematizer, honoring the plurality of routes to wisdom. Travelers from distant places came to learn his ways, taking with them fragments of gate practice that blended with their own traditions and birthed new permutations. In this mingling, the dream gates multiplied, not identically but analogically, as each culture reimagined thresholds to suit its own needs. Enoch rejoiced at the creative proliferation, seeing it as proof that the gates were not proprietary but a common inheritance. He wrote little, preferring to guide people directly, though some disciples compiled manuals that reflected his spirit. In the quiet of his later years, he would sit at dusk and speak softly of gates he had not yet entered, acknowledging the humility of a pilgrim on a lifelong road. He admitted the temptation to feel finished, the danger of imagining one had seen enough to be authoritative without further learning. His remaining claim was this: the gates never stop being instructive, for the world changes and each generation needs new listening. He thus taught his listeners to be lifelong pilgrims, always ready to be reshaped by the gates they had yet to encounter. When he finally grew too old to walk the hills as he once had, Enoch's students carried his methods forward into public institutions, churches, guilds, and civic bodies, embedding gate practices in the daily rituals of communities. His dream maps informed the construction of libraries, hospices, and marketplaces designed to replicate the thresholds he had seen. These institutions changed incrementally, building cultures that valued repair, justice, and imaginative reading of futures. In time, the dream gates lost their strangeness, becoming ordinary features of a civic architecture that honored both the human and the heavenly. Stories about Enoch multiplied, his passages through gates becoming parables told by firesides, reinterpreted for each new audience and generation. Some tales were tall, others were painfully mundane, illustrating little miracles of mending and reconciliation. The accumulation of these stories functioned as a living curriculum, a litany that trained hearts in the subtle skills the gates required. Even those who doubted his dreams often found themselves practicing the ethic of the gates, because it worked in the living world. In his final counsel, he spoke often of the smallest gates, the ones people ignore because they appear insignificant, a neighbor's grief acknowledged, a debt forgiven, a word of correction given gently. He said these are the keystones, the small acts whose compound interest builds a just and resilient community. He warned against looking only for grand visions and ignoring tiny portals that admit the virtues of daily life. His message was simple and practical: tend the micro-thresholds and the macro-order will follow. Enoch taught that the dream gates are not solely metaphors but modalities of perception, practices that train people to notice thresholds wherever they occur. The gates could be mirrored in law, in art, in markets, in kitchens, and in the architecture of public life. They were integrative practices that demanded both imagination and discipline. He left a legacy not of esoteric secrets but of embodied techniques for civic and personal flourishing. The gates, he said, are invitations to repair the world one threshold at a time. His students carried forward the ethic of gate tending into policies that redistributed resources, fostered inclusion, and institutionalized hospitality. They used rituals to mark transitions in ways that honored both people and planet. The results were not utopian, but they did create societies less prone to violence and more inclined to repair. Enoch's dream gates proved adaptable, capable of being translated into law, into liturgy, into community practice, and into education. It was a slow, patient revolution of thresholds rather than a sudden overthrow. Over centuries, his teachings were refracted through changing cultures, but the core remains: the world is threshold, and our moral imagination must be trained to cross wisely. Gates offer possibility and danger, opening worlds while demanding ethical readiness. Enoch's legacy invites perpetual vigilance and perpetual hope, a practice of crossing that is both daring and humble. It is a promise that the dream can be made living if the community will learn the art of threshold care. People who live by the ethic of the dream gates become stewards, caretakers of liminal spaces that mediate between conflict and reconciliation, between poverty and abundance, between silence and speech. The practice reshapes leadership into stewardship and governance into care. Enoch's dream does not end with the man, but continues in the acts of those who choose to guard thresholds with humility and creativity. It becomes a cultural technology for flourishing across ages. And so, when nights are long and the world seems brittle, his voice returns in the hush, reminding travelers that there are gates yet to be opened and practices yet to be learned. He urges patience with the slow work of repair, courage for necessary speech, and tenderness for those who guard fragile thresholds. The dream gates remain, an ongoing curriculum for hearts and polities, asking each generation to step through with wisdom and to return bearing gifts for the living world. Enoch's story is, in that way, unfinished, an open passage he hopes will be walked by many and tended by the countless hands that make communities bearable and beautiful. He walked at the edge of a world that was not yet named, the sky above him folding like a book between two hands. The air smelled of rain that had not fallen and of incense burned in memory. Even without looking, he felt the weight of 1,000 voices that kept themselves just outside hearing, like moths circling a candle. As night gathered, the ordinary noises of the town fell away and a different kind of sound came forward, soft and insistent. It was not music in any familiar scale but an arrangement of syllables and rhythms that slipped into the space behind his eyes. In that hush, the first whisper took him by surprise, a presence that knew his name before he had learned it for himself. He did not know then whether these whispers were gift or trap. They arrived in the seams of sleep, the light dozing between wakefulness and dreaming, and they spoke as if reading from a ledger of lives. Their tone was neither cruel nor kind, merely certain, as if they were recounting facts that no one else remembered. Some nights the whisperers began with images, not words, a landscape of glass trees under a pallid moon, a river that flowed backward toward a mountain that had no base. Those images laid themselves like tiles across his mind, and from their joints the whispers threaded meaning into memory. Each image felt ancient and new at once, like a script written in a language of light. It was a small thing at first, an idea placed like a seed, which then pushed its tiny insistence into the soil of his life. The seed grew into a thought that altered the way he walked the streets and looked at people. He began to notice marks on the palms of strangers, tiny crescent scars shaped by something unseen, and the whispers would tell him the story behind them before the person had spoken. The voices called themselves the Watchers in the idle way of those who have names that echo in other tongues. They said they had been given a task long before the memory of humans kept time. There were catalogs and guardians and sometimes meddlesome teachers, according to the cadence they used. Yet they never declared allegiance to any one god or doctrine, their devotion was to observation itself. Enoch was the first to listen with intent rather than fear. He learned to distinguish instruction from temptation and to answer the Watchers with questions of his own. His questions were blunt at first. Why us? Why now? What is your purpose? Their answers arrived in fragments and stories that opened into other questions, until he found himself walking a corridor of meanings with no end in sight. Once, the Watchers showed him the architecture of memory. They peeled back the layers of a man's childhood so gently that Enoch felt the bones of that life like the inner scaffolding of a house. There were rooms he had never known existed, and in each room a scene played out again and again, subtly altered, offering him clues about causality and consequence. From those rooms, the whispers learned to guide and misguide in equal measure. Their language was a map of sensation, where a taste could stand for a feeling and a color could mean a past event. Enoch learned to translate in his head, inventing a syntax out of the impressions they left. Translation became a craft, an art of not only receiving but shaping, because once the Watchers had spoken, the world rearranged itself to accommodate the notion. The more he tuned, the more the whispers increased their offerings, like a teacher moving from single letters to entire texts. They showed him glimpses of other Watchers too, some like himself, others vast and terrible, their forms hinted at by the ripple of a dream. These larger Watchers held the kind of silence that carried weight, and when they spoke the landscape of his mind trembled as if in wind. Not every whisper was benign. Sometimes they delivered warnings in the cadence of a bell struck at dawn, urgent and ringing through the chamber of sleep. They described places where the fabric between worlds had thinned, where shadows gathered with purpose and names were forgotten. In those warnings, Enoch felt a cold like an animal's breath, and he learned that knowledge could be a burden heavier than ignorance. Yet even warnings were not mere doom. The Watchers taught him strategies for moving through places where boundaries frayed. They suggested ways of binding memory to objects, of planting small talismans of meaning so that what was lost could be found again. These techniques were subtle, ritualistic almost, and Enoch practiced them like a young apprentice learning a delicate craft. Time, under the influence of the Watchers, became pliable. In one whispered session he would live entire decades in what seemed like a night, watching generations rise and fall like carpets unrolled before him. In another, he would pause an instant on a single breath and explore every potential that lay in that breath. The elastic of time taught him humility, for each stretch revealed consequences that reached beyond his immediate sight. People around him began to notice his absences and his soft, distracted ways. He would wake with the weight of knowledge that made ordinary conversation seem brittle. They called him dreamer, oddity, prophet and jest, never knowing how closely his tangle of waking and dreaming had been woven into the fabric of their lives. His life became a mosaic of errands and revelations, humor and a persistent reverence for the gentle chaos in his mind. There was power in knowing, and with power came temptation. The Watchers sometimes offered him hints about how to nudge events. They suggested a small word in a leader's ear, a touch on the shoulder to steer a lover's path, a slight misdirection that would alter a harvest. Enoch stood at the crossroads where morality and efficacy met, and he understood that altering the course of someone else's life carried an ache of responsibility. When he intervened, even with good intent, the echoes rippled in ways he had not anticipated. A life he had mended on one shore could unspool disaster on another, and the whispers would trace the pattern back to him like a spider returning to its web. He learned to be surgical and sparing, to respect the complexity of the human weave. This restraint became itself a lesson imparted by the Watchers, a lesson wrapped in quiet approbation. There were nights when the whispers vanished altogether, leaving him stranded in silence so complete it had its own music. Those absences felt like punishment or respite, and he never knew which. He spent those nights reevaluating what he had heard, cataloging every suggestion and its result, trying to make meaning out of the tangle. In the blankness he found a strange kind of clarity, and sometimes that clarity was the only truth he trusted. Other nights the Watchers were many and overlapping, their voices competing like musicians in a crowded square, each certain of their tempo. They argued about outcomes and destiny as if debating the route of a river. Enoch listened to their quarrels and discovered that even beings who measured time could be petty, jealous, and convinced of their own rightness. Their personalities bled through the whispers. Some were tender and coaxing, guiding him toward gentleness in his dealings with others. Others were sharp and pragmatic, pushing him toward decisive action without regard for sentiment. There were also acidic voices that delighted in paradox and would speak riddles designed to unsettle rather than instruct. Enoch learned to identify these temperaments, using them as a sort of compass. He began to notice physical traces of the Watchers' interventions in the world. A field he had thought to bless yielded a different sort of grain than expected. A child born under a whispered auspice had eyes that reflected starlight, and a small town recovered a lost tradition as if remembering a dream. These consequences proved that the whispers were not only metaphysical murmurs but forces that left fingerprints on matter. Not every imprint was benevolent. In the corners where plaques of frost lay too long on a window, Enoch found the residue of a misapplied whisper, hope misplaced, a promise overheard and never kept. The landscape held the detritus of meddling, little cruelties and large misfortunes that once started as a whisper and then blossomed into fact. He learned the painful truth that even the best of intentions could calcify into something hard and unforgiving. The Watchers, in their endless curiosity, sometimes grew bored and toyed with dreams as a child would a puzzle. They would rearrange memories for sport, swap a laugh from one life into another, or place a stranger's face where it did not belong. These pranks, at first amusing, sometimes produced consequences that people felt in their bones. Enoch came to see how fragile identity could be when fragments were traded like coins. As his relationship with them deepened, Enoch began to question the origin of the Watchers themselves. If they had been Watchers before the first of human stories, who watched them? His questions opened a new layer of whispers, ones that spoke of hierarchies and councils and a set of laws that apparently even the Watchers observed. He discovered that their freedom had limits and that their curiosity had mechanisms of regulation. They told him, without malice, that their duty was observation and cataloging, and that tampering beyond certain boundaries incurred a kind of metaphysical debt. There were names for such debts and rituals for repaying them, and when the debt was great, the consequences could be severe. These constraints revealed a universe more structured than the chaotic dreamscape in which he had first encountered them. Enoch saw then that the whispers were not a single chorus, but a chorus of choirs, each with its own region of competence. Some kept track of births, others of weather, and others still of the thin places where dreams leaked into waking. He learned to call upon the right choir for the right question, and over time his queries grew more precise. This specialization felt remarkably bureaucratic, and the hum of it amused him to no end. He met those who were damaged by whispers, people who woke with knowledge they had never wanted, who bore sudden and inexplicable grief, who found themselves drawn to dangerous places because an image had lodged itself like a splinter. Enoch tried to help them by translating the images, by turning the sharp fragments into words that could be held and examined. Some healed, others could not be returned to their previous selves. He had to accept that some changes were irrevocable. Once, a woman came to him with eyes that had seen too much of the future. Her nights were crowded with what was to come, and she was exhausted by the constant procession. The Watchers had bored into her sleep and left her a map of potential disasters. She had lived among them and become brittle. Enoch taught her how to fold those maps up and place them in a drawer, to attend to the present as a practice, and in time she discovered the relief of narrowing her heartbeat to the room she stood in. This lesson about boundaries he learned to apply to himself. He enforced pauses, rituals of unlistening that involved the mundane, washing his hands, tracing the grain of a wooden table, lighting a match and letting its small, steady flame absorb the excess of voices. Those gestures anchored him and created sanctuaries in which he could think without being invaded by visions. Ritual, he discovered, was more than superstition. It was a tool of mental sanitation. At times the Watchers told stories of places beyond human comprehension, a city with streets like braided hair and a market of lost names. These descriptions had the quality of fevered dreams and yet contained architectural logic that hinted at a different cognitive order. Enoch would sketch them in charcoal, careful to render the strange geometry, and those drawings became objects of study. Scholars and curious minds later would argue about their origin, but to him they were memory objects, translations of what had been whispered in the throat of night. The Watchers seemed to delight in paradox, and so they taught him that to remember was sometimes to forget. They showed him rituals of forgetting, delicate procedures for removing a memory like extracting a splinter. He practiced these on small things at first: a bad taste, the memory of a slight, the ache of a short-lived disappointment. The procedure required bravery, because the act of forgetting could be as dangerous as the act of remembering. There were myths that claimed the Watchers had fallen from grace by their desire to intervene, but Enoch found those accounts to be simplistic. Instead, their errors were often civilian mistakes of curiosity, misapplied empathy, a misread map, a joke taken too far. The moral weight of their acts felt human in scale, and that realization complicated the easy narratives of villains and angels. He began to think of them as professionals with virtues and vices, not as simple archetypes. In the course of his life he met others like him, listeners who had cultivated an ear for the whispering wind. Some were cynical and used the whispers to sway politics or amass influence. Others were secretive and kept entire corners of their town under their counsel, closing off lives to the open exchange of fate. Enoch studied them, wary of falling into similar traps, and he learned to recognize the telltale signs of someone who had let whispers become orders. One listener had turned the whispers into an empire of prophecy, selling peace of mind to those who could pay. His shop of futures had a window full of hourglasses, and he would tilt them for a fee. Enoch despised the trade but understood the temptation. The whispers provided leverage. When one could see the outline of possibility, it became difficult not to monetize that advantage. In contrast, another listener used the whispers to knit estranged families back together, leaning toward quiet acts of kindness that produced no fanfare. That person reminded Enoch of the gentler path, the possibility of service without spectacle. He kept their methods in mind when he felt himself tempted by grandeur. Small, anonymous acts of mending satisfied a deeper part of him than any public praise ever had. Dreams themselves evolved under the pressure of constant attention. People began to ascribe value to certain nights and to avoid others. A market of dream rituals arose in which some tried to purchase silence and others sought access to visions for creative or political gain. Enoch watched this commerce with a growing unease, sensing that the contamination of intention would alter the purity of natural dreaming. He feared a time when the dream would become currency and the song of the night would be auctioned. The watchers, for all their attention to cataloging, could not be fully controlled. They had desires that outlived the boundaries humans tried to set. Some sought a deeper intimacy with the mortal hearts they observed, others refused to be bound to the strictness of non-interference. Their internal disagreements sometimes spilled into the waking world, where competing whispers tugged at different people, producing strange synchronicities and confusions. Enoch often found himself in the middle of these crosscurrents, a mediator between wills he did not fully comprehend. During one long season, the whispers kept circling back to the same image, a tower of bone rising out of a fun, light like blood pooling at the base. They returned to it until it became an obsession, and Enoch felt the image lodge in him as if it were a secret seed pressing to grow. He visited the fun described in the visions, and though nothing there matched the tower, the ground there resonated with a kind of memory. The experience revealed to him that the whispers were not always literal. Sometimes they offered metaphors that demanded patient interpretation. Compelled by that tower image, Enoch began to travel to places long neglected by maps. He walked roads that had been abandoned, spoke with caretakers of ruins, and collected half-remembered tales. Each fragment he gathered was a thread that, when woven together, suggested a history of contact and miscommunication between watchers and the societies they shadowed. The deeper he dug, the more complex the relationship appeared, until even his sense of cause and effect felt reversed. In his travels he learned the language of markers, cairns that pointed not to treasure but to memories, stones etched with patterns to signal places where a dream had been anchored. People had developed informal systems to warn others of the presence of whispers, to hide from them, or to entice them. These cultural adaptations fascinated Enoch and made him admire the quiet ingenuity of ordinary lives. Communities had always adapted to the unseen. They had survived, in part, because they had learned to read the undercurrent. Sometimes the whispers revealed history in a personal way, showing Enoch the lives of his own ancestors as if they were close relatives visiting by starlight. He learned the names of people long dead and the songs they sang before sleep. Those transmissions were at once intimate and impersonal, like photographs placed on a table and then explained from a distance. They taught him that continuity was not only a line but a lattice, and that each life was threaded to others in ways that patience would eventually reveal. A recurring motif was the idea of translation between species and scales. The Watchers showed him how a sparrow's migration mirrored a tribe's shifting allegiances, and how a river's seasonal tantrums echoed the mood of a distant capital. They suggested that patterns repeated at every size, like fractals of fate. This notion reshaped his thinking, enabling him to see connections between what seemed unrelated and to act with a humility born of scale awareness. He also learned the cost of bearing witness. There were places where being a watcher meant you felt every sorrow twice, once as observation and once as sympathy. Empathy, the Watchers taught, could become a wound if not tempered by practice. Enoch developed techniques to distance himself without becoming cold, a kind of professional reserve that still allowed for genuine feeling. That balance proved essential for a man who had to read people's lives without being swallowed by them. Love entered his life like a rumor, then a steadfast fact. He grew attached to someone who was not a listener in the same way he was, and their different approaches to the whispers created friction. She believed in a simpler world, one that required less metaphysical bookkeeping and more stubborn affection. Their differences forced Enoch to choose when to share the burden of knowing and when to keep the whispers to himself, a choice that sometimes cost him intimacy. Their conversations revealed different philosophies. She argued for action rooted in visible need, while he argued for a sensitivity to patterns tucked into dreams. They both made concessions, and in those small trades their love deepened. Together they tried to protect a small corner of their life from the incursions of prophecy, carving out rooms in their home where dreams were barred like uninvited guests. Those rooms became sacred for them, places where the world had to be lived rather than interpreted. The Watchers, in return, were curious about his domestic arrangements and sometimes tested the boundaries he set. They would slip images through the cracks, like a draft that chills a closed room. Those intrusions were never violent but persistent, and he responded by strengthening his rituals and building layers of symbolic defense. It was less an act of war than a negotiation in the language of sleep. Once Enoch tried to bargain with the Watchers. He offered himself as an apprentice, a conduit who would only carry whispers to those who needed them, if they in turn agreed to respect the lives they touched. The negotiation had the flat, practical tone of a merchant haggling over woven cloth. They accepted only partially, reminding him that they were not wholly negotiable, that their curiosity was their nature and could not be fully tamed. After that partial agreement, the whispers grew more complex in their moral reasoning. They proposed dilemmas. Would you save a village by dooming one life? Would you erase a painful memory at the cost of a useful lesson? Enoch found himself answering such hypothetical questions in the quiet hours, sometimes sleeping badly as he considered unlikely scenarios. These moral thought experiments hardened into habit, preparing him for real decisions that would demand courage. A crisis arrived in the form of a storm that was not meteorological but metaphysical. For several nights a wave of shared dreams swept through his region, placing the same image into millions of minds. The image was a flock of birds falling like pages from a book. People described it with alarm, some with wonder, but the uniformity of the vision suggested a directed interference. The town panicked and then muttered explanations, and Enoch realized that the Watchers had either failed or been challenged by another force. He sought the source of the wave and found a place where the boundary had been breached, a ruin whose stones hummed with foreign observance. There, he encountered a Watcher unlike those he had known, an entity that was an echo of the Watchers and perhaps a rival. Its voice was larger and colder, and it probed at the edges of his consciousness as if testing the thickness of his resolve. This confrontation taught him that the world contained not only caretakers but also predators, entities that hungered for attention and would cause havoc to get it. The encounter forced him to act in ways he had practiced theoretically. He organized a circle of listeners and citizens, sharing what small spells and rituals he knew, and together they wove a barrier of attention to hold the breach. It was laborious and humble work, the sort of thing that required patience instead of heroics. The task reminded him that sometimes defense was not magnificent but steady, an unglamorous kneading of intention until the breach closed. When the immediate crisis abated, the Watcher's tone toward him changed. Their whispers grew reflective and weightier, as if they were consulting a ledger and considering his account. They began to reveal the histories of their kind in more detail, maps of origins and migrations and diplomatic incidents that read like bureaucratic epics. These stories were not always flattering, they contained regrets and acknowledgments of harm. Listening to them, Enoch realized the Watchers had their own story of loss and repair. He began to write down everything he could remember, feeling an obligation to make a record that might survive the natural erosion of memory. His notebooks filled with sketches, transcripts, and transmutations of dream images into words. For him, the act of recording was sacred. It was a way to anchor things the whispers might otherwise take away like water through fingers. Those pages became a private archive, a litany of encounters and lessons. As his notebooks multiplied, scholars and seekers came to him. Some arrived with reverence, some with skepticism, and some with a hunger he could not name. He taught those who were careful and refused to entertain those who wanted to monopolize the whispers for gain. In teaching, he refined his own understanding, explaining these phenomena forced clarity on experiences that had at times felt shapeless. Instruction solidified the ideas into something usable without making them dogma. Inevitably, his life drew scrutiny. Authorities came and asked questions with bureaucratic chill, curious about whether these whispers could be weaponized. Enoch deflected what he could and withheld things he thought might bring harm. He learned to live with the tension of being both a public figure and a private keeper of delicate knowledge. That dual life taught him the necessity of discretion and the price of being a steward of secrets. With time, his voice changed. He learned to cradle hope gently, to give it in portions that could be carried by human hands. He became adept at giving counsel that left room for personal agency, at suggesting possibilities without prescribing fates. The Watchers continued to whisper, but they learned to do so with a new respect. Perhaps Enoch's steadiness had taught them that humans could be partners rather than mere subjects of curiosity. In old age, he felt the whispers shift tone again, as if the choir now sang of endings and archives. They guided him to places of closure, reconciliations left unfinished, artifacts that needed to be returned to the memory of a people, names forgotten that demanded being spoken aloud. He moved with a different urgency then, one that was not the feverish rush of youth but the patient tending of a garden about to be set to seed. Service became a rhythm that matched the pace of his body. When the end approached, the whispers did not disappear but softened into a lullaby of details. They showed him a final sequence of visions not as prophecy but as a set of images to be understood and released. Each vision was small and exact, a child spinning wool at a fireside, a door closing softly, a dog asleep in the lap of an old neighbor. These were not grand revelations but the ordinary riches of a life observed closely. He passed on his notebooks to a small circle of trusted people and taught them the rituals of listening and the ethics of restraint. He urged them always to prefer the needs of the living over the cleverness of the Watchers. His last lessons were practical and human. Always boil water before listening for clarity, always ask if help is wanted before offering it, and always remember that some knowledge is a gift and some is a weight. After his death, the Watchers continued to whisper, as they always had, to other ears and into other nights. Their presence persisted in the margins of human life, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes central. Those who had learned from Enoch told stories about his patience and restraint, and those stories became themselves whispers in a different register, the kind that people shared at hearths to remind one another to be careful with the lives of others. Across the generations, the figure of Enoch became a quiet legend, a mediator between the sentient and the unseen, a man who negotiated the delicate balance between curiosity and care. He became a pattern to emulate and a cautionary tale. The watchers who whispered in sleep continue to be a part of human culture, their interactions with people maturing in complexity as societies develop better vocabularies to speak about consent, privacy, and the ethics of knowledge. In some places, rituals grew that honored the boundary between dream and waking life. People built libraries of small, mundane taboos and ceremonial acts that prevented casual intrusion, such as leaving a cup of water undisturbed or recording a memory in a leather-bound book that no outsider could touch. These customs were not superstition but crafted civil protections against the seduction of easy knowledge. The presence of such practices showed how cultures adapted to the rhythmic pressure of the unseen. There were always debates. Philosophers argued whether the watcher's interventions counted as benevolent oversight or as a paternalistic imposition. Poets wrote about the beauty of being watched because it meant that someone paid attention to your small acts. Politicians sought to regulate access to dreams, proposing laws that made it illegal to broadcast certain visions without consent. Enoch's legacy threaded through these debates, a reminder that attention could be either blessing or burden. As centuries accumulated, the myth of the Watchers splintered into many retellings. In some versions they were guardian angels, in others minor deities, and yet others simply metaphors for the human conscience. Each culture polished the story to its own needs, and in that process the original complexity often became a simplified emblem. Still, in quiet corners of the world, people continued to keep the practices Enoch had taught: careful listening, the ethics of consent, and the small rituals that protected the boundaries of the mind. The modern age, with its technologies and accelerations, offered new terrain for the whisperers. Screens and networks provided conduits, places where dreams could be recorded, manipulated, and sold. The Watchers adapted in some ways, slipping into algorithms and data streams, finding new ecosystems to study. Enoch's watchful ethic became more important than ever. People needed to be taught how to resist the commodification of their dreams and maintain control over inner life. New practitioners arose, technicians who used machines to filter and translate dream speech, therapists who fused old-world rituals with contemporary psychiatry, and artists who used whispers as raw material without exploiting their human sources. These new occupations carried with them both promise and peril, just as Enoch had known. The field matured into a professional milieu, complete with its own ethics boards and standards of practice, which helped curb some of the more rapacious impulses that had once characterized the market in visions. At the same time, cults and opportunists emerged to promise quick answers through direct access to the Watchers. Some sold purified dreams, others peddled the illusion of prophecy, and a few tried to monopolize the line between human and whisperer. History repeated itself in a new key. Where attention and mystery had value, entrepreneurs would find ways to monetize them. The ethical framework Enoch had championed remained a bulwark, but it required constant reaffirmation. Across epochs, artists and musicians kept returning to the motif of the Watcher whispering in sleep. Paintings depicted half-formed faces bending over a sleeper. Poems rendered the hush into meter and rhymes that trembled like leaves. The creative impulse was a kind of translation, a way for societies to absorb and process the persistent uncanny. Art insisted on the humanity of the phenomenon, refusing to let it be reduced to mere mechanics. For individuals, the personal experience of being whispered to remained varied and intimate. Some found guidance that saved them from despair, others were burdened with knowledge that hollowed them. The variability underscored the need for consent and care in dealing with such phenomena, a need Enoch had been among the first to articulate. Personal narratives accumulated into communal lore, and with each retelling, the relationship between watchers and humans gained new dimensions. In the end, the watchers served as a mirror of human complexity. They reflected back our curiosity, our hunger for meaning, and our capacity to do harm when we pursued knowledge without ethics. Enoch's life, with its patient negotiations and small acts of repair, offered a model for how to live under the pressure of attention. To listen was a skill, to respond with restraint was wisdom. When you think of them now, think not of capricious spirits but of a phenomenon that surfaces when attention becomes intense, the tendency to surveil, to record, to narrate other people's lives. The Watchers are perhaps a mythic embodiment of that tendency, nudging us to be mindful of what we consume and how we use it. Enoch's story remains an invitation to practice humility in the presence of the unknowable and to honor the fragile line between gift and theft. And so the whispers continue in the thin hours of night, and the small pauses between breaths, leaning into the ears of those who are ready to hear. Some answers they offer will be helpful, some dangerous, and some beautifully useless. The wiser among us learn to keep their hands gentle and their hearts brave, to offer shelter to those who return with too much knowledge, and to remember always that the world needs both watchers and the watched, balanced by the quiet labor of care. In the beginning of the vision, Enoch stood in a stillness that felt like the pause between two breaths, as if the world had inhaled and held itself for a purpose he was only just beginning to sense. The air around him was not ordinary air. It tasted like memory and thunder, a metallic sweetness that made his tongue feel afraid and eager at once. He moved because not moving felt impossible, and the ground replied with the faint echo of steps that belonged to time itself. He was guided by a light that did not come from any single point but seemed to unwrap itself from everywhere at once, wrapping him in a presence like a garment woven from dawn. The light had weight and warmth and a language that pulsed in his chest like an old song he could not name. It beckoned him onward without words, teaching him the first lesson of the vision, to follow when the world of waking would tell him to stay. The first trial arrived like hunger, a slow gnawing that settled in his bones and drew out faces from his memory, faces of kin, of strangers who had shared a loaf, and of those who had been lost to frost and fever. Enoch felt each memory laid bare, the small textures and imperfections of life magnified until they became entire landscapes of regret and tenderness. He was asked not to erase these memories, but to carry them through the seeing, to allow them to color his understanding like dye in water. As he walked, the scenery shifted with the ease of a thought moving into speech. Fields folded into cities, cities dissolved into seas, and the seas became a mirror that held the sky. In that mirror, Enoch found versions of himself, some younger, some older, some with wounds that had never healed, each one offering silent counsel. The trial here was humility, for he had to recognize his smallness without losing the knowledge that even smallness contains the spark of destiny. A voice, neither male nor female, spoke from behind a curtain of light and asked him to name what he feared most. Enoch could have said many things: loss, failure, the collapse of the world he loved, but none of those truths satisfied the voice. Instead, he recognized that fear itself, the habit of shrinking away from wonder, was the enemy he must meet, and meeting it required a steadiness he had not known he possessed. The second trial came as temptation dressed in prophecy, scenes of possible futures laid before him with the hush of inevitability. He saw empires rise and crumble, languages die and be born, faces of children he had never met and yet could feel as kin. The trial demanded choice, the difficult taste of knowing too much or too little, and in that demand Enoch learned how knowledge can be a gift and a burden in the same breath. Beyond the temptation of future sight, there was a corridor of judges, figures whose eyes were like polished bronze and whose hands were woven from root and sky. They did not condemn with fury, but with the quietness of seasons turning. Their judgments were necessary, not cruel. Enoch understood that judgment within a vision does not merely punish but reveals, peeling back lies until the truth stands exposed and raw. Each revelation carried a body with it, stories of men whose vows had been eaten by time, lovers who had traded loyalty for safety, children raised on songs of fear. These were not stories told to him, he lived them anew, as if walking into other people's bones and feeling hearts beat in unfamiliar rhythm. The trial required compassion, the ability to bear witness without becoming so heavy that he could not rise again. At a place where the sky was seam-splitting blue, he met the Watchers, beings who had lingered at the edge of human understanding and watched with a curiosity that had once been holy and had become a kind of ache. They explained, through gestures and images, the cost of separating notice from participation, of watching a world without risking part of oneself in it. Enoch felt their loneliness as a physical pressure and was tested on whether he would pity them, pity himself, or withdraw into cold judgment. In the next chamber of the vision, colors behaved like voices and the shadows like memories. A river passed through that place, running backward as though trying to remember its source, and along its bank Enoch saw the remnants of promises that had been broken like twigs. The trial here demanded integrity. He had to learn to mend language to its anchor, to speak truths without bending them for comfort. Night arrived in a manner that was neither sudden nor slow. It arrived like a revelation that had been rehearsed. In that night, the sky filled with eyes, stars that blinked with the sorrow of sages and the mischief of children combined. Enoch was asked to name the source of their light, to reconcile the cruelty of distant suns with the tenderness of warmth, and in naming he discovered the precarious balance between explanation and reverence. An old woman appeared in a clearing, her hands full of seeds that glowed faintly even in the dark, and she told him that every seed contains a history of suns. She placed a seed in his palm and asked him to decide whether to plant it in the dust of now or to carry it forward into a time that might never be. This trial tested his patience, for some truths mature only in time and require guardians who can wait without losing faith. Enoch's feet carried him to a staircase carved of memory and carved again by doubt, each step a syllable of a language he thought he knew. He climbed and descended until the direction itself blurred into a pattern, until he could not tell whether progress was measured by height or by depth. Here the vision asked him to understand that spiritual ascent often looks like descent, and that crises of faith can be the very ladders that take a man higher. At the midpoint of the ascent, a child cried out, and each cry sounded like a judgment and a blessing at the same time. The child's voice folded the present into the future like a hand closing a book to savor the last sentence, and Enoch felt responsible for that voice in a way that anchored him. The trial was love in miniature, the task of protecting something fragile without smothering its growth into a distinct being. He encountered a door with a lock that hummed like a hive, and the key was a question he could not answer without betraying himself. Behind that door were scenes of violence and compassion braided together, as if human extremes had been sewn into the fabric of destiny. The choice before him was to open the lock and risk seeing the rawness of reality, or to leave it closed and remain in the safety of partial sight. Enoch chose to unlock the door, for he had been taught that ignorance can be a cruelty when it shelters the powerful. What he saw made his throat ache: towns rebuilt on old graves, oaths written in blood and washed out in apologies, hands that offered bread and fists that refused it. This trial confirmed a truth he could not escape, that vision is a kind of responsibility and ignorance a deliberate deprivation. After the door, the terrain shifted into a forest of reasons, each tree a rationale for why things were as they were, and every leaf a small justification whispered into willing ears. As he walked, he heard the rustle of many explanations and felt how comfort could be built on flimsy foundations. The trial asked whether he could hold multiple truths without letting them tear him apart, whether nuance could be a shelter instead of a battleground. In that same wood, an animal approached whose eyes were mirrors. It reflected moments of selfishness he had not yet owned, hints of cowardice, and also moments of bravery he had never acknowledged. The beast did not accuse, it invited recognition, and acceptance of these reflections became a trial that demanded honesty more than punishment. The ground then opened into a plain of names, each one etched into the soil like a story and shimmering with lives that had been or might be. Enoch walked this plain as if treading on pages, feeling the friction of each syllable underfoot, and he learned that a name holds not only identity but obligation. This trial made him careful with speech, because to speak a name aloud was to summon its weight. At a horizon where the clouds gathered like congregations, a voice asked him whether he would carry the sorrows of others as his own or leave them where they lay. He discovered that carrying sorrow can become a kind of martyrdom if it is not done with wisdom, and leaving it coldly unattended can harden the soul into stone. The balance between empathy and preservation of self was another trial that taught him how to hold both tenderness and boundaries. A bridge appeared, woven from strands of regret and golden hope, quivering over a chasm that smelled faintly of old iron and damp parchment. Crossing it required that Enoch speak aloud a confession and a promise, and in the sound of those words the bridge steadied as if built on faith that answered in kind. The trial here taught him that confession can be a structure, and promise a mortar that holds the world together when it might otherwise fall apart. He met a man with wings that bore the stains of earth, an angel who had walked among mortals and returned with stories of wounds. They conversed without words, and Enoch felt the angel's fatigue like a hand squeezing his shoulder gently. This visceral exhaustion was a test. Could one keep compassion alive when it has been worn thin by a witness to endless suffering? The answer shaped him, teaching endurance measured not in invulnerability but in the capacity to be present despite pain. The vision led him next to a market where ideas were bought and sold, where lies were wrapped like sweetmeats and truths were offered at no cost but demanded attacks of courage. Enoch watched traders persuade listeners with glib promises and saw those promises corrode like acid when they met reality. The trial was discernment, a sharpening of senses to detect what was valuable and what was merely polished deceit. Sometimes the trials arrived in silence that bore weight, a quiet so dense it pressed on his chest and forced him to listen inward. In that silence, he heard the faintest thrum of his own heart and the larger heartbeat of the world aligning with it. The task here was patience, learning to trust silence as a source of revelation rather than as an absence to be filled by fear. At another turn, he found a field of mirrors, all reflecting possible Americas of being, the ways his life might have unfolded under different choices. Each mirror tempted him with the comfort of what-ifs and the sting of loss that never happened. The trial was to accept the irreversibility of choices while still honoring the value of what might have been, which required a reconciliation of affection and regret. Then came a valley where the wind spoke in riddles and each answer carried two meanings, both true and contradictory, like an old parable that refuses the neatness of a single moral. Enoch learned to hear the multiplicity in meaning and to resist pressing every mystery into the shape of a practical lesson. This trial rewarded the mind that can hold paradox without feeling compelled to flatten it. A temple of stone rose before him, its pillars carved with scenes of human endurance, births kept safe, storms weathered, hands that mended what had been broken. Inside, priests of memory invited him to lay his own scars upon the altar and to accept the solidarity offered by those who had suffered before him. The trial was submission to communal healing, the knowledge that wounds sometimes require the touch of others to scab over gently. Deep within the temple, he encountered a book whose pages were translucent and whose ink flowed like light. Each page contained a life in a single sentence, and when he read them he felt the lives bloom in his chest as if they were his own. The trial was stewardship, whether to read every page and thus be burdened by every fate, or to read selectively and risk becoming ignorant of suffering that might have called for intervention. An old instrument sang him a dirge in a language of walls and gates, and as its melody sank into his bones he realized that every structure of society is both protection and prison. The song urged him to evaluate which structures should be preserved and which should be torn down, acknowledging that tearing down invites new dangers as well as relief. The judgment required by this trial was political and spiritual both, asking for wisdom that measures consequence as well as intent. He met a woman who wore a crown of sew-together days, each day a patchwork of joy and sorrow, and she told him that time itself is patient but not impartial. She asked whether he would accept the slow justice of seasons or demand the sharpness of immediate correction. The trial here was a moral weighing, to wait for the natural unfolding of rightness, or to act fast and risk harm, even in the hope of good. Enoch was sometimes presented with riddles that were not meant to be solved but to be lived, small paradoxes that insisted he live their tension rather than resolve them. He found himself holding contradictions like precious stones, turning them in his hands until he learned to see from more than one angle. The trial taught him that certain truths do not yield to neat answers but deepen when held with care. At one point, an ocean opened like a book and within its waves swam histories that refused to stay under the surface. Old betrayals rose like whales, old loves like flotsam. Everything the world had tried to forget came to float. Enoch had to decide whether to dive into the cold and bring these things back to the light or to let them sink where their weight could not drag the living under. The trial was again about rescue and restraint, for not every recovered object returns the world to health. He learned of a bell that tolled for the turning of the days and whose sound could be bent into illumination or into terror depending on the hand that held it. He understood then that symbols are dual-edged. They can call people to kindness or to fanaticism, and the trial here asked him to steward symbolic power with humility. This lesson echoed in his decisions thereafter, where he used language like a careful craftsman rather than a shout that could set a prairie aflame. There was a room where laughter and grief shared the same breath, a place that taught him that joy carries sorrow's shadow and sorrow contains seeds of joy if tended with patience. In that space his own laughter came unbidden and mixed with tears, and he felt humility like a hand on his forehead. The trial asked him to accept complexity without reducing it to comfortable binaries. A figure offered him an orchard of dreams and warned that each dream harvested too early might wither before its season. He tasted those dreams and felt their ripeness and their danger. To pluck them prematurely would be to cheat the world of its slow rhythm. The trial was temporal discipline, the recognition that some tasks require waiting even when desire screams for immediate fruit. He was sometimes given maps that showed routes of consequence, lines tracing the ripple of single acts through generations, but the maps always had blank spaces where human will remained undecided. Enoch learned that foresight is never absolute, that prediction collides with freedom, and that the trial was the humility to act without the illusion of omniscience. His steps therefore became small and deliberate, informed but not enslaved by the possibilities he had seen. A corridor lined with mirrors of water showed him the faces of those who would follow his teaching and those who would oppose it, and he was tempted to tailor his words to gain favor with one reflection over another. The trial demanded fidelity instead, the courage to speak a truth that might be unpopular because sincerity serves a larger good. He understood that faithfulness can alienate but also preserve the integrity of what is given to say. There were moments when the vision fed him with images of abundance, fields waving with grain, rivers thick with fish, towns humming with craftsmanship, and in those moments he felt hope like a warm garment. But the same image could be read as temptation, the comfortable ease that lulls a heart into complacency. The trial was to steward abundance without allowing it to distract from justice, to enjoy without forgetting the poor at the edges of plenty. A bellows of wind once forced a song into his ear that was half warning and half lullaby, and as he listened he felt both propelled and stalled. The music was a test of discernment, asking whether he would move toward the urgency the song suggested or remain where wisdom counseled caution. Choosing between action and restraint became a recurring trial, one that asked for a rhythm informed by prudence and passion alike. He encountered a mountain that demanded a sacrifice of certainty. To climb required letting go of two cherished beliefs that had once seemed like anchors. Enoch found that the act of losing certainty could be agonizing and clarifying at once, and the mountain's test remained in his bones long after he had descended. This trial taught him that faith is refined not by clinging but by the willingness to reform itself in light of new understanding. Within a hollow cave, echoes multiplied his doubts until they sounded like accusations. He stepped into the echo to meet them and discovered that spoken fears, when confronted aloud, often lose their tyrannical power. The trial thus revealed the therapeutic aspect of naming. To speak fear in community diminishes its authority. A garden of forking paths presented him with 1,000 possible lives, each choice branching into a delicate lattice of consequences. Enoch learned that every path walked leaves surrounding possibilities untraveled, and that his heart would carry the memory of both the chosen and the forsaken. The trial consisted of making peace with pathos born of necessary decisions, embracing the beauty of the life formed rather than mourning all unlived alternatives. He met an instrument maker who fashioned tools out of silence, and from that artisan Enoch learned to construct moments of quiet that could be wielded like instruments of healing. The trial was mastery of stillness, to not use quiet as avoidance but as a skill to shape conversation, attention, and care. Learning this craft changed how he taught and how he listened. At a river of judgment, waters divided into streams that flowed into forgiveness and streams that flowed into retribution, and it became clear that justice is never a monolith but a confluence of currents. Enoch was asked to help tilt the channels, to nudge the flow toward restoration without neglecting the need for consequence. This trial taught him the subtlety of mercy when aligned with responsibility. A childless tree offered him fruit only if he first planted a promise in the soil below it, and Enoch understood that many blessings require covenant and labor, not mere desire. He planted and then waited, learning patience and the discipline of tending rather than expecting sudden miracles. The trial emphasized that participation in the world's healing is often slow and sacrificial work. The vision sometimes placed him before a tribunal of silence where questions were judged more than answers, and the hush itself was a pressure that forced inward clarity. In that silence he discovered the shape of his convictions and the presence of doubts he had hidden from himself. The trial of inner clarity taught him that a sound conviction is one that has been passed through the sieve of honest reflection. A stone library kept books that could not be read by the eye alone but required the heart's attention. The pages hummed when touched by compassion and dimmed under callous hands. Enoch learned to read these volumes slowly, feeling each word's weight as if counting coins for a pauper. This trial valued the economy of empathy, counting small acts of kindness as currency capable of purchasing transformation. He saw a city whose streets were paved with promises never fulfilled, and the architecture of that place bore the fatigue of deferred dreams. Walking those lanes taught him the cost of neglect and the kindness of restoration, for small repairs to a life can accumulate into repaired neighborhoods. The trial was civic, recognizing that spiritual vision demands practical action in the streets, not just elevated words in the towers. There were waters that erased memory when crossed, waters tempting him with the promise of relief from pain if he would forget certain faces and events. Enoch stood at those banks and hesitated, for forgetting can be mercy and betrayal at once. The trial asked whether the relief of forgetting was worth the moral cost of erasing lessons and obligations. A host of small lights gathered like moths around him, each light a story that had almost been lost, and their combined glow felt like a chorus of minor salvations. He learned to honor even the smallest rescue, for it was often the accumulation of minor mercies that saved days from becoming tragedies. The trial taught reverence for incremental goodness. At times, his own shadow argued with him, reminding him of impulses he preferred to sanitize from his self-image, and the tension between shadow and conscience became a private tribunal. He discovered that integration, making friends with the shadow, yielded a more honest and stable self than suppression ever had. This psychological trial required courage to face one's own capacity for harm and to transform it into a fuel for vigilance rather than denial. Enoch once stood before a field of unspoken apologies, letters floating like paper boats on a lake, and each apology needed a recipient to be complete. He learned that contrition uncommunicated is a weight on the soul and that reaching out to say sorry can be an act of bravery that frees both parties. The trial of reconciliation involved initiating repair even when the path ahead was uncertain. In a hall where time folded like fabric, he encountered ancestors who spoke in lullabies and warnings, their voices knitting a lineage of courage and flaw. They did not blame him for inherited failings, but asked for vigilance in breaking cycles. The trial here insisted on understanding history not as a chain to bind, but as a chain to be learned from and carefully reforged. A constellation of small sins hovered above him like insects around a lamp, each one dazzling and dangerous in its own modest way, and the temptation to think any single sin inconsequential was strong. He was tested on whether he would accumulate small moral injuries into a hardened center or address them while they were still small. The lesson was that moral vigilance is built from attending to the small transgressions, not only the glaring crimes. He visited a hospital whose wards held the world's griefs in varying stages of convalescence, and walkers there kept vigil with hands that smelled of ointment and old prayers. Enoch felt the pull to stay indefinitely, to watch over each patient's slow recovery, but the trial reminded him that one cannot carry every burden without losing the ability to stand. The wisdom demanded was that of allocation, how to give deeply without being rendered ineffective by total devotion. A light that was both sun and lantern asked him whom he would trust with power, and the decision required him to weigh character more than competence. He saw rulers with skill but hollow hearts, and others with humble hands but unwavering ethics, and the trial pressed him toward the latter. This taught him the political dimension of the spiritual life, that choices about leadership are moral acts with real human consequences. Enoch was led to a cliff where voices of the past and future sang in counterpoint, each melody trying to seduce him into a simple allegiance to one temporal direction. He realized that allegiance to the past can be nostalgia that stunts growth, while allegiance to the future can be a neglect of duty to the present. The trial asked him to embrace responsibility in the now while honoring continuity and hope. He met a craftsman who forged chains of promises, and watching the smith's labor he saw how binding commitments can be both protection and prison, depending on their purpose. The craftsman taught Enoch to craft vows carefully, to use words as decisive acts, and to break what must be broken with ritual care. The trial of vow-making transformed his understanding of promise from casual speech to sacred architecture. In a hollow where sin and sorrow communed, he was offered a cloak that could hide his worst deeds from others, and he was tempted to accept it so that he might present a blameless face. Choosing against the cloak, despite the comfort of concealment, became a trial of vulnerability, accepting exposure as a path to honest reparation. This decision was pivotal. It refined his integrity into a mirror rather than a mask. A room full of clocks ticked at different rhythms, and in trying to align them, Enoch understood that human lives do not march to a single tempo, and that rushing a heart can be as cruel as slowing it unfairly. The trial was tempering time, learning when to speed and when to slow, how to honor another person's pace without sacrificing urgency where it mattered. The lesson settled into his interactions, teaching him to be patient with human unfolding. He encountered a child who had never been allowed to play, and in freeing that child he felt a liberation that was also an indictment of systems that crushed delight. The trial here was about restoring humanity's lighter parts, recognizing that repair is not only about righting wrongs but also about making space for joy. It reminded him that a healed world is not merely functional but also playful. There was a scorched field where forgiveness had been burned like stubble, and Enoch was asked whether he would help replant hope in that ash. The task required courage and humility. Replanting asked for patience and an acceptance that not every seed would take. The trial taught him resilience, to try again even when outcomes are uncertain. A maze of law and mercy wound before him, each corridor promising neat justice but often delivering unintended harm, and he was taught to weave both principles together rather than elevate one above the other. The trial demanded legal imagination tempered by compassion, crafting solutions that held both principle and personhood in view. This work became the backbone of his judgments and teachings. He found a choir that sang only in regret, where every psalm groaned with what might have been, and he learned to introduce hymns of possibility that could stand beside sorrow without dishonoring it. The trial was curating hope, making space for mourning while refusing to let lament be the only hymn sung. He discovered that hope is not denial but a discipline of the heart. A pair of scales weighed his motives with a precision that surprised him, revealing not only the outcomes of his acts but the hidden inclinations that made them so. He saw greed disguised as prudence, vanity masked as good taste, and charity given for applause. The trial demanded ruthless honesty, the kind that prunes the roots rather than trimming the leaves. At moments, he was called to lay down a weapon he had carried for a long time, realizing that even righteous anger can calcify into obsession. Letting go was not weakness but a strategic surrender that opened new avenues for healing. The trial taught release as a form of strength, the power to put down what one has borne long enough. A pair of lovers appeared, their embrace both fierce and fragile, and Enoch watched to learn what makes love endure beyond passion. He discovered that love thrives on small, ordinary acts, tending, listening, showing up when inconvenience threatens comfort. The trial revealed that fidelity is as much a practice as a feeling, built on the architecture of daily choices. He traversed deserts of rumor where truth had been parched into dust, and in those barren places he learned the work of bringing water to the mouths of people starved for fact. The trial was prophetic clarity, speaking truth into regions where lies had become local folklore, and doing so with courage and gentleness. The result was a slow revival where trust began to seep back into cracked soil. A council of elders asked him to arbitrate between two communities whose histories had been entangled in both mutual aid and harm, and the trial asked for peacemaking that does not whitewash past injury. He mediated with an ear for truth and an eye for reparation, recognizing that deep peace requires both realistic accounting and bold imagination. The lessons of that negotiation remained with him as a model for creative justice. Enoch was shown a loom weaving the future from threads of present action, and each thread bore the name of a choice he might make. He learned to handle these threads with care, to avoid pulling too hard or cutting without thought, for the fabric of days depends on the tenderness of the hands. This trial educated him in the craft of consequence. He walked into a fog where certainty could not find purchase and was taught to navigate by touch, by the feeling of the world beneath his palm rather than the map of assured belief. The trial was practical faith, trusting in the slow accumulation of small, compassionate acts when ideology offers only neat answers. He learned to trust the process more than immediate clarity. There were times when laughter saved him, bursts of absurdity that loosened tight grief and cracked open spaces for unexpected delight. These moments were not trivial, they were trials in disguise, tests of whether he could hold solemn duty while also permitting levity. The balance between reverence and laughter kept his heart from ossifying. At one juncture, He stood before a mirror that reflected possible futures of a community, and every reflection required a different sacrament. Some needed sacrifice, others needed celebration, and the trial was discerning the appropriate liturgy. He came to love the liturgical imagination, the sense that communal life is shaped by rituals small and large, and that the right ritual can help heal what mere policy cannot. This sensibility colored his approach to any gathering of people in need of repair. Enoch was invited into the house of a miser whose wealth had become his identity, and the trial there was to teach the man how to let go without losing selfhood. They walked through rooms filled with coins and memories alike, and the miser found that generosity returned more than it took. The lesson was practical alchemy, the conversion of hoarded goods into communal life that nourishes both the giver and the receiver. In the vision's depth, he sat beside a sick child and discovered that some prayers are acts of companionship rather than pleas for miracles. The child's small hand in his taught him that presence is a prayer when words fail. This trial humbled him. In some settings, the best ministry is attendance, an unglamorous but holy duty. He encountered a scholar who confessed that knowledge can become a citadel that isolates its keeper from the rest of humanity, and the trial was to ensure his learning served life rather than eclipsing it. Enoch promised to translate knowledge into shared nourishment, to make wisdom useful in the messy business of living. The scholar's admission became a corrective to arrogance disguised as intellect. A storm of accusations once pummeled him, each gust screaming of betrayals he had not committed, and he was tested on how to maintain clarity under slander. He did not lash back but answered with calm rectitude and consistent deeds, and in time the falsehoods lost their power. The trial taught the virtue of steadfastness under public trial. There were fields of silence where music was forbidden and those who played broke their fingers for notes, and Enoch learned the courage required to restore voice where suppression has become law. He became a subtle insurgent for beauty, introducing song in ways that healed rather than inflamed. The trial here celebrated the creative defiance that preserves humanity in the face of dulling edicts. A city of glass revealed to him the dangers of perfect transparency, where privacy had been sacrificed to the illusion of safety, and the test asked whether he would defend the sanctity of private sorrow. He learned that dignity requires some secret places and that absolute exposure can be a cruelty disguised as virtue. The trial refined his sense of protective love. At times the vision showed him courts of repentance where offenders and victims met in carefully choreographed exchange, and he discovered that ritualized apology can either be a true bridge or a theater of mock absolution. He was trained to read the soul's posture in such encounters, to encourage genuine contrition rather than theatrical absolution. The trial taught discernment in the work of reconciliation. Enoch learned how to fashion laws of mercy that carried teeth for protection but did not crush hope, and the challenge was to create practices that were both tough and tender. This delicate craftsmanship was a recurring trial, balancing deterrence with restoration. He came to understand systems that survive are woven from both compassion and accountability. A garden of broken promises taught him the art of tending commitments back into life. With careful pruning and consistent watering, even a fractured oath could sometimes be reborn. The trial was forgiveness practiced as discipline, not sentimentalism, requiring both requester and responder to labor at restoration. This practical spirituality shaped his approach to broken relationships in the waking world. He met a people who refused to speak their pain and watched as silent suffering hardened into cruelty, and he recognized the importance of cultivating safe spaces for confession and healing. The trial demanded that he help create languages for grief so that it could be processed rather than internalized into bitterness. This became a cornerstone of his pastoral care. In another vision, a wheel turned with spokes carved from different virtues, and the entire machine only functioned when all spokes bore weight together. He learned that justice without mercy, or mercy without justice, throws the community out of balance. The trial joined ethics into an integrated architecture of life. A lamp that burned cold served as a parable for reason divorced from warmth, and he was taught to reunite intellect with compassion so that insight would not become cruelty. The trial encouraged him to place warmth at the heart of wisdom. The result was a ministry that sweetened understanding with solace. At times he was tested by solitude, because prolonged isolation can distort even the noblest mind, and he was forced to find ways to remain accountable to others while journeying alone. The trial taught him to maintain a circle of interlocutors, carefully chosen companions who could hold him to the truth without stifling vision. This balance preserved clarity and prevented the loneliness that breeds arrogance. He saw architecture built on fear and recognized that many institutions survive by feeding anxieties, and the moral task was to reimagine structures that nurture rather than exploit. The trial asked creativity in communal design, imagining schools, markets, and councils that encourage flourishing rather than prey on insecurity. This imaginative labor became a template for reform. Enoch encountered a tide that erased boundaries and asked him whether he would defend borders that protected the vulnerable or let walls stand in service of greed. He learned to distinguish healthy boundaries from oppressive walls and to craft lines that supported life. This trial was political imagination coded in ethical sensitivity. Sometimes the vision presented him with mechanical beasts of burden that carried the accumulated sorrow of generations, and he was tested on whether he would lighten the load or merely redirect it. He chose to relieve weight where possible, using careful dismantling rather than theatrical redistribution. The trial refined his approach to structural suffering. A luminous archive cataloged human acts, not to indict but to instruct, and Enoch read there the small histories that repeat in cycles until someone breaks them. He began to recognize patterns. Neglect yields epidemics of despair, generosity multiplies, cruelty calcifies into systems, and kindness, tended, becomes habit. The trial became the long work of pattern recognition and intervention. At a marsh where voices of lost aspirations lingered, he learned the value of promises kept to the small and the local. Rescuing a drowning hope can sometimes prevent an ocean of sorrow. The trial rewarded attentiveness to micro-commitments, the unnoticed daily pledges that become the scaffolding of larger trust. He emerged from that marsh with a devotion to the ordinary fidelity of life. An old gatekeeper taught him the difference between gatekeeping that preserves sacredness and gatekeeping that hoards privilege, and the lesson required a bitter parsing of motives. The trial was practical ethics for institutions, open where welcome heals and guard where preservation prevents violation. He learned the craft of just hospitality. Enoch was shown a theater where myths are performed and realized that cultural stories shape the moral imagination more powerfully than laws alone. The trial was to be a storyteller who curates narratives that cultivate courage and compassion rather than fear. He learned to speak in parables that built capacity for empathy. He watched a factory transform raw despair into usable skill and marveled at how systems can be designed to redeem pain into purpose when intended kindly. The trial required vision and labor and a refusal to accept cynicism. This hope for systemic transformation became a recurring motif in his teaching. There was a machine that turned hatred into currency, and dismantling it required creativity, patience, and the courage to reallocate resources to life-affirming projects. The trial taught him that economic systems can be moral projects and that reorienting them is both spiritual and political work. He developed a language for economics that named scarcity and invented generosity. In some parts of the vision, he encountered creatures who spoke only in questions, and the discipline of answering them with humility sharpened his capacity for inquiry over assertion. The trial favored conversational curiosity, the ability to say, "I do not know," without abandoning leadership. This method preserved learning and avoided the stagnation of dogmatism. A storm of saints and sinners convened and argued like neighbors over a shared fence, and the trial was mediating between zeal and cynicism without becoming either. He learned to hold hope's flame against the winds of doubt while listening to the sober counsel of experience. The result was a tempered courage that refused both fanaticism and despair. Enoch encountered a river that split time from space, and the challenge was to move through moments as if they were rooms, each with its own rules and lessons. He adopted a practice of situational wisdom, learning that some virtues are universal while others require contextual nuance. The trial encouraged a flexible fidelity to good. Finally, as the vision reached deeper and deeper, he came upon a silence so vast it was like an ocean, and in that ocean the last trial was offered, to accept that not all questions will ever be answered. There was sorrow in that acceptance and also profound relief, for to live faithfully without total comprehension is itself a kind of grace. The vision did not end with triumphant certainty but with a commitment to continue walking, companion to suffering and joy alike, carrying what he had learned into the world of day. When Enoch returned from the vision, the ordinary air tasted different but not foreign. It carried the residue of revelation as if the waking world had been slightly rearranged. The trials had not furnished him with a manual for living but with muscles of heart and mind trained to bear complexity. He spoke less often of final answers and more of practices, acts of listening, repair, and steady presence that could transform ordinary human life. His friends noticed a change in his gait, the way his eyes lingered on edges where others had rushed past, and they asked him about the secrets he had seen. He answered with stories rather than proclamations, and people found those stories like doors ajar, inviting but not imposing. The trials within the vision had turned him into a teller of parables that honored doubt as much as they honored truth. Enoch's teachings became a braid of ethics, mercy woven with justice, action balanced with patience, and hope tempered by sober realism. People argued sometimes, for the life he advocated was not easy and required daily moral courage, but they also found solace in the steady rhythm he proposed. His influence was less about converting belief than about transforming practice. In private moments he revisited the visions like a gardener tending a distant orchard, remembering seeds planted and the careful waits between seasons. He understood that the trials were not a test to be passed and then forgotten, but an ongoing discipline that will return in new forms whenever one grows in depth. Thus he kept watch over his own soul with humility and a willingness to be corrected by love. Those who walked with him learned to recognize their own shadows and to name them without shame, because Enoch taught that confession and repair were community tasks rather than solitary burdens. The trial he had faced alone in the vision became communal work, a shared apprenticeship in compassion and courage. Together they practiced the difficult arts of listening and acting. Legends about his journeys grew, of course, as legends will. They embellished and simplified in equal measure, creating a public persona that sometimes tempted him with vanity. He guarded against that by returning repeatedly to the private disciplines he had learned: silence, service, and the practice of small mercies. In so doing, he kept the trials alive as a refining fire rather than a pedestal that would calcify him into caricature. He taught that law must always be married to mercy and that power must be accountable to the vulnerable, adding the caveat that blunt dogma can become its own form of slavery. These were not new ideas, perhaps, but his articulation was shaped by his trials into a practical grammar for living. People found in that grammar a framework to rebuild communities, not by grand gestures alone but through steady repair. Sometimes the trials within the vision returned in dreams, smaller and more intimate, enfolding younger ones who were just beginning to learn the language of compassion. Enoch would stand at the edge of these incipient visions and guide those budding souls with the patience of a teacher who knows the long arc of moral formation. The trial of mentorship became a joy as much as a responsibility. In old age, when his hands trembled and his feet slowed, he cherished the ordinary tasks that once had seemed mundane: mending a pot, listening to a neighbor's complaint, caring for a garden. He understood now that these small labors were the steady food of the soul, and that the trials he had undergone were meant not to elevate him above life, but to deepen his capacity to love it. He died, if that is the word, like one who folds a well-read book and places it back on the shelf with gratitude. The memory of his vision endured in those he taught, an inheritance of practices rather than dogmas, and the trials he had carried became part of a communal map for navigating sorrow and joy. Communities formed and reformed themselves around the small disciplines he had taught, learning to be patient with their failures and rigorous with their compassion. In that way, the trials rippled outward, changing ordinary human patterns over time. Even after his passing, the image of Enoch moving through trials remained a beacon to those who find cosmic visions intoxicating but become quickly lost when the work of repair is left undone. His life demonstrated that spectacle is not an end in itself, and that the true work of the spiritual life often looks like plumbing and remodeling, necessary, tedious, and sacred. The trials within the vision had prepared him for these unglamorous labors, and so he became a patron of the small, persistent goodnesses that sustain civilization. In songs and small recitations around kitchen tables, people would recall the scenes he described: the river that divided mercy from retribution, the market of ideas, the childless tree that taught patience, and the book of translucent pages that required reading by heart. These recollections were not mere memorabilia, but working manuals for those who needed guidance in crisis. The trials became living metaphors, applied in contexts their origin could not foresee. Over generations, interpretations multiplied and sometimes drifted from his original lessons, as all things living do, but the core of his teaching, balancing love with justice, patience with action, remained stubbornly useful. Scholars argued about the finer points, artists rendered scenes of light and shadow, and families kept quieter traditions rooted in day-to-day acts of fidelity. The trials were thus preserved in both debate and domestic life. There were moments when entire communities decided to reenact parts of his vision, not as mystical ritual but as pedagogical exercise, walking through model trials to practice the virtues he had learned. These exercises helped ordinary people develop muscles of judgment and mercy that have no substitute in abstract instruction. The trials had become a curriculum of compassion. Even now, if one listens carefully in the margins of history, one can hear the faint echo of Enoch's walk through the vision, the rustle of pages being turned, the whisper of seeds being planted, the careful step of someone choosing to stay and repair rather than flee. The echo asks each listener to imagine which trials they would endure and which they would avoid, to consider the forms of courage this age requires. It is a living question, passed like a baton through ordinary hands. In the end, the trials within the vision teach a single stubborn lesson: that revelation without practice is a brittle jewel, brilliant but useless in sustaining life, and that the deepest seeing is the seeing that heals. Enoch's path did not free him from sorrow or doubt, it trained him to meet them with a craft honed by experience and humility. If there is salvation in the story, it is the slow work of love applied day after day. As you listen to this, perhaps driving, perhaps standing in a kitchen, the trials described are not only his but yours too. They arrive in different guises but ask the same of anyone who chooses to walk toward the world with eyes open. The vision does not promise easy answers, only the promise of steady training: how to suffer wisely, act bravely, love deeply, and repair patiently. The work is lifelong and never finished, and in that unfinishedness there is hope. Remember the small practices that sustained him: name your fear out loud, offer compassion physically by showing up, speak truth with gentle courage, protect the privacy of the suffering, repair what is broken with honest labor, and teach the young to hold paradox without panic. These are not heroic acts in isolation, but the accumulation of tiny insistences that build a world worth living in. The trials are invitations to that patient co-creation. So when the vision closes, do not expect a final line etched into the stone, rather expect a door opening into ordinary life where the real work begins. The trials Enoch endured within the dream were scaffolding, not an apex, guiding him toward a life where small, faithful acts ripple outward. Your own trials will be similar in their shape if not in their dress, and like his, they will demand endurance, humility, and love. Leave with one last image, Enoch walking back into the town at dawn, carrying with him a sack of seeds, a book, and bandages for hands that had been tending wounds. He moves slowly, not because he is weakened, but because he has learned the discipline of pace, and his eyes hold the calm that comes from having been tested and chosen patience. His is a quiet heroism, a life lived in the trenches of repair, summoned from a vision but fulfilled in the texture of everyday kindness. Enoch walked like a man who had learned to step lightly between waking and dreaming, as if the ground itself might tilt and reveal a different sky beneath his feet. He spoke rarely and listened more, because he had been taught that the ears are the doors to prophecy and the heart the chamber that must be kept calm. On long nights when the rest of his village lay wrapped in wool and smoke, he would stand at the threshold of his home and watch the stars bruise the dark until they sang with a sound only he seemed to catch. That sound was not music in any ordinary sense. It was a kind of slow remembering, as though the heavens were rehearsing lines for a play they had performed before the world began. The first vision came to him in the way of thunder without storm, a pressure at the temples and the sudden, inexplicable knowledge that the sky had a body and the body could sleep. Stars that had always burned with an unthinking steadiness blinked, not from fatigue but from something like resignation, and in that blink Enoch saw entire ages fold into themselves like brittle paper. He dreamed of a great bed stitched from galaxies, where constellations lay like old wives recounting their marriages to time. And in the space between two stars, a whisper formed the words, "The sleeping stars will count the forgotten names of men." From that whisper rose a sequence of dreams that felt less like interruptions and more like rooms of the same house he was being invited through. Each room had a different tone. One smelled of salt and iron, another of pressed flowers and rain on hot stone. In one vision he walked through a cathedral made entirely of milky light, and the vaulted ceiling was the curve of a comet's tail. The choir were numbers, chanting to a rhythm his bones recognized. He awoke with the taste of comet dust on his tongue and the conviction that these visions were not intended for him alone but as warnings stitched in ornamental language for anyone who would remember them. Enoch learned to record what he could with a simple reed and ink, though he recognized the inadequacy of letters when compared to the living architecture of a dream. Words gathered like moths in his hands and sometimes tore themselves to pieces against the lamp. Yet he persisted, knowing that some shapes only take shape when they are set down in the world of wakefulness. He wrote out the way the stars coughed like old men when they tried to speak, the way the moon traced the outline of a sleeping child's face, the way constellations sometimes turned themselves into maps of cities that had never been built. The prophecy of the sleeping stars was not merely poetic musing, he realized. It was an ethical demand disguised as cosmology. When a star sleeps, it ceases to bear witness, and when witness fails, the ledger of the world begins to fray. In that fraying, names slip into a dark margin and deeds unaccounted for become the seeds of future storms. Enoch's visions taught him that the universe was a ledger that required constant tending, a duty that fell partly to people who could remember and speak for what the stars had forgotten. As his dreams deepened, other figures began to appear beside the sleeping constellations, shadow people who kept lanterns the size of a child's palm and read aloud from books whose letters were written in the size of mountains. These watchers did not see the world in the way human eyes do. They read the pattern of consequence and tended to its heat like gardeners turning soil. They were not angels of typical forms, but custodians, small and solemn, who polished the edges of events so that no trivial harm would cleave loose a destiny's thread. Enoch recognized in them the ancient labor of attention, the deliberate act of keeping. The dreams taught him that forgetting is contagious. One star, once asleep, might influence the narrow orbit of a satellite or the tilt of a mind, and so a single downed memory could ripple into neglected duties, broken promises, and the slow erosion of covenants. Enoch saw courtyards where courtrooms had become playgrounds for smaller calamities, where children imitated the careless gestures of those who had failed to keep watch. He felt an urgency rise within him, a heat that demanded outward motion. Prophecy, he realized, was not only receiving images but moving through them until their lessons took physical form. In these nocturnal journeys he encountered a woman with hair full of winter wind who peeled back a star to reveal an entire city asleep in its hollow. The city's citizens were preserved like specimens under glass, each wrapped in the memory of a single act, a promise, a marriage, a stolen loaf. Some acts were luminous and preserved with honor, others were gray and brittle, preserved by shame. The woman told Enoch that the stars cataloged human gestures, and when the stars slept, so did the communities that relied on those gestures being remembered. Enoch began to perceive time as quilted rather than linear, as if each dream were a patch sewn to another out of moral thread. Ages overlapped like transparent leaves, and the dead conversed with the yet-to-be-born without awkwardness or effort. He learned to move through those layers, to touch the edge of a forgotten decision and feel its warmth still clinging like a bruise. That sensation became both his burden and his compass, to walk the seams and draw the frayed threads back into the weave. One particularly vivid night he observed the stars sleeping in a pattern that resembled a closed eye, and inside that eye he saw the face of a child who would never be born unless someone remembered the promise that would have made that birth possible. He woke with a number on his tongue, an address or a year perhaps, and followed it to a field where an old man had stored a chest of letters unread. The letters held apologies and half-pleas and invitations that had been misplaced by grief. Enoch sat in the grass and read them aloud, imagining that the act of voice might wake something small and tender in the otherwise vast system of celestial forgetting. And so Enoch found that wakefulness is contagious too, a restorative contagion that can travel from the mouth back to the sky. He learned rituals of remembering that did not require incense or elaborate altars, but the humble practice of naming aloud what had been done and what had been promised. A name spoken with care acquitted a kind of debt. It called back a star by recognition rather than by force. Those who listened with him began, in small ways, to mend fissures, a returned tool, a mended roof, an apology offered in the shadow of a doorway. The visions did not spare him warnings. They showed him cities whose stars had chosen slumber as a form of protest against cruelty, a cosmic refusal to condone injustice. When a society's cruelty became habitual and proud, the stars turned away, hoarding their light in dreamlike sleep. Streets grew dim, crops failed not from drought but from an invisible absence of accountability. Enoch learned then that the lights above are not mere ornaments but partners in the moral economy. When they sleep, the world grows poorer. This realization led Enoch to confront leaders who believed that power could be exercised without remembrance. He approached them not with thunder but with the small steady persistence of one who has seen how memory functions as leverage. He told stories from his dreams during the midday rest when men were soft with heat and harder to contradict. Some dismissed him as a fanciful old man, but others rested their chins in rough hands and listened until their brows smoothed and their voices grew quieter, as though the act of hearing made an intermediary in them. Sometimes they would ask him for signs, for certainty, and the dreams obliged in their own uncanny way. He was shown a grove of statues whose faces were the likenesses of forgotten promises. If anyone carved a scar into one, the weather turned sour until someone else made a countergesture of repair. Proof, and Enoch's visions never arrived as lightning but as consequence, a stubborn, accumulating logic that revealed itself over seasons. He taught listeners to watch for those consequences like watchmen on a parapet, because prophecy, in these terms, was more about long-term stewardship than sudden miracles. As news of his visions traveled, people came to him with their own scraps of memory, their own half-formed guilt and hope, seeking a kind of reconciliation they could not otherwise achieve. Enoch listened and used the structure of his dreams to stitch together narratives that could be spoken in the market square. A woman who had stolen bread and lived with the lie for years found release when the community agreed to a small ritual of restitution they performed together beneath a sleeping star. The act did not erase the past, but it rebalanced the ledger and, remarkably, the star, unattended for so long, flickered as if with an approving sigh. The prophecy of the sleeping stars unfolded into a practice as much as a doctrine, a communal attention to the small and stubborn tasks of remembering. Children were taught the lesson not as superstition but as civic habit. A festival arose on the night when the sleeping constellations were least numerous, and the entire village lay awake reciting the names of those who had been left out of public story. They called it the Night of Small Lights, and people lit candles and bottles and set them along the river, where the stars could see their reflections and perhaps feel less compelled to nap. Even the stones, Enoch thought, seemed to straighten in the morning after a night of small lights, as if memory worked like an invisible mortar. But not all responses were so gentle. Skeptics and those whose comforts depended on other people's forgetfulness grew uneasy. They preferred the oblivion of sleeping stars because it allowed for erasures and clean conspiracies. They argued that the world runs on forgetting, pain requires leeway, mistakes demand concealment, and so a little societal amnesia was not only useful but humane. Enoch found this logic dangerous. Kindness without truth, he saw in his visions, becomes its own kind of rot. One night his dream took him to a market in which the goods were traded in memories rather than coin. A man tried to sell the memory of his child's first laughter, and buyers discussed its price as if trading spices. Enoch watched the transaction with a grief that tasted like iron. Some memories are meant to be communal gifts, not exclusive commodities. He woke and found his hands trembling. He wrote down the law that sprang from that dream in the clearest script he could manage. There are memories that are common property of a community, and those must be guarded against privatization. The sleeping stars seemed to respond when he reoriented the community's imagination in this way. Not always immediately, but over cycles of seasons, he observed a change in the way light fell on houses and in the steadiness of men's steps. Even the animals appeared to move with a greater confidence in fields where promises were kept. Enoch saw this as modest proof that moral action and cosmological balance were not metaphors but interactions, and their causal relationships were subtle and patient. A small justice done could be like a stone dropped into a dark pond. The ripples would reach farther than immediate perception allowed. Yet the dreams also taught him the dangers of zeal divorced from tenderness. On one occasion, a group of watchmen inspired by his teachings bound a suspected forgetter and humiliated him in the square, convinced that public shame would wake the stars. The punishment only bred covert resentments and a stubborn new layer of secrecy, and the stars slept on, undisturbed, as if to teach a harsher lesson. Coercion never replaces remembering. Enoch understood that calling the world to account requires a discipline that is patient and respectful, a cultivation of memory that seeks restoration rather than retribution. He saw shapes in which entire societies had institutionalized remembrance, not as a spectacle but as a daily domestic practice. Families kept ledgers of small kindnesses and misdeeds, and neighborhoods convened councils not to punish but to reintegrate. In these imaginings, the sleeping stars were rare, because the work of attention was shared and routinized. The stars were not lazy in these places, they participated. Enoch wrote with a new tenderness then, noting that communal practices could be designed to invite the stars to stay awake. In some of his clearest visions, he watched children play a game in which they asked one another for stories of ancestors they had never met. The children listened with reverence and then retold those stories, adding small details from their own lives. Through that invented continuity, the dead remained conversational and the future became a patient listener. Enoch understood that memory had to be taught through pleasure as well as duty, and so he began to encourage playful retellings of old mistakes, transforming shame into instructive folklore. The dreams also showed him resistance in forms that surprised him. A mute clockwork called the sleepbinder walked through cities at dawn, gathering strands of night and binding them into swaddling bands around the foreheads of those too eager for change. The device did not punish, it merely slowed the rush of those whose hands were always working to rearrange the world. Enoch learned to appreciate restraint. Sometimes the act of waiting, the intentional allowing of time, is itself a form of wisdom. Not all slumber is neglect. Some sleep is careful preservation until the right moment to wake arrives. In a vision that left him shivering, he watched a field where the sleeping stars were replaced by mirrors, and people mistook their own reflections for light. They stopped addressing each other and began to worship the likenesses projected back at them. Over generations, the community's obligations became inward-turning and trivial, and their institutions became elaborate facades for vanity. Enoch recognized in that nightmare the danger of self-referential societies, where attention circulates among equals and no one remembers those beyond the circle. Another recurring image was of a ledger made of living bark, whose pages were written in sap and whose spines were stitched with the hair of the oldest living animals. The ledger grew as trees grew, and the entries were whispered into its rings by migrating birds. Enoch often sat beneath such a tree in his visions, reading aloud the pages so the bark would not forget. He felt then that his role was a small but essential one. When the celestial witnesses slumbered, terrestrial witnesses could stand in and read the record aloud until the sky returned. As his reputation grew beyond the border of his valley, other dreamkeepers sought him out, each with a different hue to their visions. Some saw the stars sleep as a political act, others saw it as ecological collapse, some framed it in purely spiritual terms of estrangement between creator and creation. Enoch welcomed them all, partly because hearing variations of the same prophecy clarified its contours. He learned to translate the images into accessible narrative so that people with different anxieties could recognize a portion of the truth within their own lives. Some nights the heavens gave him a vision wrapped in deep mercy. He saw a mother who had lost a child and poured her grief into a small lamp that burned without smoke. The lamp attracted moths that drew patterns of light around the child's absence, forming an orbit of care that protected the mother's sanity. The stars, nudged by this orbit, shimmered awake for a single season and lent light to the field where the mother tended quiet vigils. Enoch kept this story close, to remind himself and others that grief, when tended, can be an offering that wakes a sleeping sky. As years passed, his body changed and his hair took the soft color of twilight. Dreams did not become easier with time. Instead, they grew more intricate, as if the cosmos trusted him with increasing complexity. He began to map correspondences. Certain constellations fell into sleep when communities erred in particular ways, and particular remedies, performed in small public acts, proved more efficacious than grand proclamations. These mappings made him cautious, because he understood how easily any pattern could be misused as a formula rather than embraced as a living conversation. There were moments of unbearable loneliness. Prophecy is strange work. It attracts the desperate and repels the comfortable. Enoch sometimes longed for the uncomplicated silence of a farmhouse that had no celestial concerns, where the nights were simply nights and the stars were decorative companions. Yet he could not turn away, for the images kept coming, persistent as tide and as moral as tide. They demanded narration, and narrating became his daily breath. He also began to sense that the dream world had its own politics and that his role was to negotiate rather than command. Some dreams offered him forces of great power, beings that promised swift outcomes if he would accept their terms. They spoke in the language of absolutes, tempting him with clean endings to complex problems. But Enoch had learned to distrust bargains that simplified. The sleeping stars taught that the world is always more tangled than any single solution can manage. And so he practiced refusal as a moral discipline, declining the seduction of easy fixes and instead favoring patient remedies. He advised communities to build redundancies in memory, ceremonies, songs, ledgers, public storytelling, seed banks, and agreements written both on parchment and in daily cuisine. The purpose was not to guard against every catastrophe, but to produce a continuous skein of remembrance durable enough to temper forgetting's undermining work. He argued that a civilization's resilience was proportional to how faithfully it could remember and act on its small duties. In one dream, he saw a low hill encircled by old women who had learned to weave the future into their cloth. Their patterns included stitches for grief, pockets for joy, and hems for common sense. Children wrapped themselves in these fabrics and did not fear the night as much. The sleeping stars above them were less inclined to nod off because the earth itself hummed with attention. Enoch realized that beauty and care are not frivolous in the face of cosmic slumber, they are tactical, even strategic. There were political ramifications to these teachings that he could not ignore. When a region's governance embraced the ethic of remembering, relations with neighboring towns improved, trade resumed its old honesty, and disputes found their way to reconciliation tables rather than open hostility. Conversely, where governance embraced forgetting as convenience, corruption spread like a secret mold. Enoch's visions, when translated into policy, often suggested surprisingly modest reforms, public recitations, accessible archives, and incentives for transparency that did not shame but remedied. One of the most persistent metaphors was of a great loom in the center of the cosmos, threads passing through and around sleeping stars like beads on a string. Occasionally, a thief of memory would snip a thread and attempt to pawn it for immediate gain, thinking none would notice. Yet threads in a functioning weave alter the pattern, and even small thefts eventually become visible as breathless seams and gaping holes. Enoch's labor, therefore, was a kind of mending, to find the gaps and urge the community to reweave them through acts of restitution and renewed attentiveness. Sometimes the dreams were brutally clear about what happens when mending fails. He saw a sea where ships were launched that carried only passengers who refused to remember the port they had left. Storms tore the ships apart not because oceans are malevolent, but because the passengers' indifference invited consequence. Enoch wrote this as a cautionary tale, not an expression of cosmic malice. The universe, in his visions, functions by certain moral logics as inevitable as gravity, and ignoring those logics, especially when one is in a position to repair them, is itself a choice with predictable outcomes. There were nights when he envied the stars, their ability to withdraw and sleep without scandal, but he also understood their constraint. Stars may slumber, yet even their sleep shapes the world of living beings who look up and learn. The act of going dark is sometimes a plea for humanity to enter its own labor of care. Enoch's task, then, was to translate the stars' refusals into languages that human beings could act upon in their small, messy, mortal ways. In his later years, his community established a place of remembrance, a simple hall where the names of lost promises and buried kindnesses were read once a week. People came not only to add their names, but to listen to the slow accumulation of other people's fidelity and failure. The practice calmed civic anxiety and invited incremental repair. The stars overhead, as if in response, twinkled with a steadier pulse than had been common in his youth. Even then, Enoch felt the thrill of humility. He was not the origin of the prophecy of the sleeping stars, he was a steward of its telling. Dreams had chosen him to be a conduit partly because he asked questions in the quiet rather than because he had any natural aptitude for revelation. He taught his apprentices to be patient conduits, to honor visions by refusing to capitalize on them for personal gain. In the act of disciplined transmission, the prophecy retained its purpose, to keep the world's ledger balanced through the ordinary acts of human attention. One last kind of vision recurred as if to remind him of the simple arithmetic of compassion. In it, an old dog wandered through a town, collecting tiny broken things, buttons, thread, a child's lost stone, and left them at doorsteps where grieving people could find them. The dog never judged, it only gathered and returned. Enoch cherished that image, for it distilled his work into a single, unpretentious ethic: gather what has been lost and return it when possible, and if not, keep the act of gathering itself sacred. When his body finally grew too weary for long nights at the threshold, his apprentices took up the practice and told the stories he had written down. They altered some details, as all tellers do, imbuing the prophecy with new metaphors that fit changing times. The core remained unchanged: attention, vocal remembrance, communal rituals, and a modest insistence on small justice. The sleeping stars continued to dream, and sometimes they woke, and sometimes they did not, but the communities that tended to memory endured with greater steadiness than those who refused. Years later, travelers would come from far lands to stand upon the hill where his modest hall had been and to hear the recitation of names under the same sky Enoch once watched. They spoke of his life as if it were a lamp that kept flickering but never quite went out. The prophecy of the sleeping stars had become less of a dire ultimatum and more of a civic ethic, a continuous choreography of remembrance taught through story and enacted through small, ordinary protocols. And that is the enduring shape of the vision, not a map to be followed once and then filed away, but a practice to be cultivated nightly, with patience and humility. The stars may sleep and wake on a rhythm beyond ordinary control, but human beings can choose to practice wakefulness in the intervals. Enoch's legacy, as the teller of these stories believed, was not that he had seen the stars sleep, but that he taught others to mind the ledger when celestial eyes closed. Listen, then, as you go about your own nights and days. Names that are left unspoken can become holes in the fabric of community, and small acts of remembering are stitches that keep the world from unraveling. The prophecy of the sleeping stars is not a prophecy that aims to terrify, but rather one that hands you the simple tools of responsibility, voice, attention, and the courage to make amends. In the quiet, when you find yourself looking up, perhaps you will imagine Enoch standing at a threshold, calling softly into the dark, asking only that you remember what you can, lest the stars decide to sleep a little longer than we can afford. Enoch slept like a man who has learned to bend his life to the rhythm of the world, steady and patient, feet finding the same worn path every morning. He lived in a time when the sky felt closer and the stars seemed to speak in a language made of light, and that intimacy with the heavens shaped the cadence of his days. When the first dream came, it arrived like a slow, deliberate tide, nudging him awake before his body fully remembered the weight of the bed. He rose with the taste of salt and distant thunder in his mouth, as if the dream had been a landscape traveled by a very old sea. The morning moved around him with ordinary tasks: fire, bread, the brushing of sleep from his hair, but Enoch could not let go of the afterimage. The edges of the dream lingered, a brightness that pulled at his attention, and he found himself turning the memory over like a smooth pebble. It had been a vision of figures moving along a stair of light, each step a note in a song he could not yet hear. That stair had carried him into places that were at once intimate and infinity, and his heart had been both frightened and exhilarated. On the second night the dream returned and unfolded with more clarity, as if the world had decided to speak in paragraphs rather than sentences. In that second visitation, he saw a court of watchers, not hostile, but solemn and vast, whose faces held both compassion and the weight of long watching. A voice, deeper than the rumble of distant mountains, spoke aloud names that were like seeds, and each name sprouted into an image, and each image carried a memory older than his village. He woke with the impression that the earth had been read aloud, line by line, and that he had been called to listen. Between one dream and the next, Enoch moved through the day like someone carrying a fragile relic. Conversations seemed to orbit a private sun. The world remained the same, but he inhabited it differently, as if his feet had been moved a hair's breadth to the left. People noticed nothing remarkable in his appearance, yet when he walked past the well or through the market, he felt the direction of his life altering under his feet. The dreams were not private fantasies. They were invitations, and invitations have the power to shift the outlines of a life. On the third night, the stair of light became a river and the watchers became sailors, guiding him along currents of memory and prophecy. He saw cities made of crystal and dust, inhabitants whose shadows were longer than their lives, and the strange geometry of justice and reward. The voice, never the same timbre twice, counted out years like beads and threaded events upon them, births, betrayals, the slow tilt of nations toward and away from mercy. Each scene was a classroom in which he learned to read the handwriting of fate and the soft mechanics of compassion. With each waking hour, Enoch found his senses sharpened as if the dreams had given him a new lens. He noticed the whispered tremble of leaves, the way light pooled differently on stone, the smell of rain as it waited in the air. People began to come to him not for his opinions, but for the patient steadiness that seemed to have been planted in him over the nights. They sought his counsel for dilemmas that had no easy answers, and his replies were shaped now by images that floated up through his chest like small ships. He did not pretend to be wise in the way the elders were, but his words carried a direction that felt like consequence. The guiding figures in his dreams spoke of guardianship and stewardship, of balance and the dangerous delight of forgetting. They showed him the fragile scaffolding that held societies together, promises kept, names remembered, obligations honored. In a vision of a valley blooming and withering, he saw how a single rusty hinge could make a gate useless and how a single kept vow could make a city sing. The detail of this knowledge humbled him. It was a reminder that the cosmic and the domestic are braided, and that small acts often echo into the heavens. Time, as taught by those nocturnal tutors, was not merely succession but architecture. In one prolonged dream, Enoch walked through a hall of doors, each leading to a season of history, and the watchers explained that each opening bore a design and a consequence. He watched a door labeled trust. Behind it was a communal table growing grain and laughter. Another door labeled treachery revealed a staircase spiraling down into quiet cages. The watchers did not condemn him for looking. They only asked him to see clearly, to notice the patterns before choosing which doors to open for others. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it dramatic in outward appearance. Enoch continued to tend flocks and mend roofs, to share bread and to sit by the fire, but his inner cartography expanded. He began sketching maps in the dust, maps of moral geography, where compassion and violence were not points but landscapes. He learned the language of thresholds, the importance of pauses, and the way a single honest word can alter the trajectory of a life. People who listened to him left with a feeling of having been turned towards something true. Dreams, however, are impatient teachers. They demanded more than sketches. In a night when the moon hung like an argument above the fields, Enoch found himself lifted beyond his normal boundaries and shown the ledger of names. Here the watchers presented the record of generations, each entry a filament connecting a person's deed to an outcome. He saw how a child's laughter later became a line of sustenance for a community and how a hidden cruelty produced a chain of disease and disharmony. The ledger was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply meticulous, a mirror that reflected the cumulative weight of choices. This meticulousness frightened him with its intimacy. He had imagined divine matters as distant and abstract, but now he saw the constellations of cause and effect drawn through human acts. The Watchers explained that their role was not to punish but to illuminate the grid of possible futures. They were custodians of notice, urging humanity to pay attention before patterns ossified into catastrophe. Enoch felt the vocation settle into his bones like a new climate. He could no longer walk through a market without tallying invisible consequences. One evening, after a day of trivial disputes and gentle reconciliations, he dreamed of a city under a sky that was both dawn and dusk. A murmuration of beings, neither bird nor cloud, formed over the rooftops and began to sing in waves that altered the very architecture of sound. Each song rearranged memory. Some notes made people remember facts they had forgotten, others made them feel the importance of actions they had once performed. Enoch understood then that memory could be a weapon or a medicine, and he felt accountable for how he would help others remember. He began to teach in ways that were subtle and patient. Rather than proclaiming heavy truths, he planted questions like stones in a stream, allowing people to build small bridges of understanding over time. He modeled restraint, and in doing so, he showed how one could bow to grief without becoming its thrall. He shared the image of the stair and the river and encouraged listeners to imagine their own thresholds, recognizing that hearing is the first labor of change. The more he dreamt, the more the material world and the visionary world braided. Once, in sunlight so bright it felt like a promise, he touched a tree and felt a response, a quick, almost animal pulse that had the memory of all weather. The trees, in the dreams, had been patient historians. Their rings held the footprints of generations. When Enoch listened to them, he learned patience that was not passivity. The trees taught him about timing, the necessity of winter, and the art of waiting for sap to rise. Not every vision was kind. He was shown cities that had forgotten to speak gently to one another, places where agreements had been made and then quietly broken, and the soil had become suspicious. In a dream that tasted of sulfur and old metal, he saw how corruption begins not with grand acts but with the erosion of small promises, the toleration of small cruelties. Watching these slow disasters, Enoch felt the hotness of responsibility like a tool in his hand. He did not become overwhelmed. Instead, he learned to identify hinge points where intervention still mattered. In a separate nocturnal lesson, Enoch crossed into a realm of geometry where moral choices had shapes and curves and predictable arcs. He saw how a single honest decision bent a community's story toward flourishing. Conversely, a selfishness that seemed small in the moment radiated outward into patterns of scarcity and suspicion. This was not prophecy as ledger but prophecy as architecture, clearly designed structures that could be read and, with care, altered. As his renown grew, measured not in titles but in the frequency of people who invited him to speak, Enoch felt a strange solitude. Coming to the edge of human sorrow repeatedly is a different kind of aloneness than the company of neighbors. The Watchers, in their many appearances, seemed to anticipate this and taught him rituals for restoration, ways to return the burdens to the sky without losing their lessons. In waking hours he fashioned gardens where silence could be cultivated like a herb. In those gardens he learned to release grief back into the world with offerings that were practical and small. The dreams also educated him about the inner life of hope. He saw how hope differs from mere optimism. Hope understands ruin and still makes plans. In one particularly luminous vision, he watched the community rebuild after flood, not by forgetting the flood but by honoring what the flood taught them about vulnerability and mutual aid. The Watchers said that hope is an apprenticeship in attentiveness. It is trained by repeated practice. Enoch practiced hope as others practice a craft, honing it until it felt simple and reliable. Dreams sometimes bring gifts that are strange and particular. One night he was handed a book that had no pages but contained landscapes within its binding when opened to the mind. Each mental page revealed lives and their small moral pivots, as if someone had made a compendium of living ethics. He read until dawn and could not tell whether the book had been given by the Watchers or produced from a deep part of himself. Regardless of origin, the book became a template for how he spoke, full of stories rather than doctrine, always anchored in concrete human acts. Enoch's relationship with his community changed as people began to sense that his presence altered their horizon. A woman who had once been quick to anger found herself slowing her steps when making a decision after speaking with him. A boy who intended to run away sat down and described his fear instead, and the fear unknotted like a rope left in the sun. Enoch did not manipulate these outcomes, he cultivated conditions where clarity could arrive. The Watchers had shown him that creating good conditions is a kind of labor that yields sturdy fruit. Sometimes the visions took him beyond human history into cosmogony, showing him the birth of stars like lanterns being lit in a vast room. These scenes were grand and did not distract him from the human scale. Instead, they threaded it into a larger tapestry. He learned to place small, human actions against the backdrop of time this way. They were both brief and consequential, like a letter placed in an archive that future readers will consult. The Watchers insisted on perspective, both to keep humility and to amplify responsibility. In one haunting episode, Enoch visited the margins where the living and the very old dead meet. The margin was a place of thin air and thick memory, where ancestors lingered to protect and to plead. It was unsettling and tender in equal measure. Faces he did not recognize felt familiar, and voices that had never spoken to him called him by names of stewardship. He realized that lineage was less about blood than about obligation. The living inherit duties from those who labored before them, and the dead are patient tutors if given auditors. Gender and power dynamics were not ignored by the dreams. Enoch witnessed women organizing communities with quiet efficiency, men learning humility in child tending, and elders teaching without claiming dominion. The Watchers made plain that different roles are necessary and that imbalance arises when any role demands more authority than care. He came to understand leadership as service in a very practical sense. To lead is to steady the vessel and to ensure that everyone on board has a voice in turning the wheel. As the seasons turned, the dreams began to show Enoch the consequences of globalization in crude forms: traders who hoarded safety, empires built on borrowed mercy, and migrations both forced and sought. In one dream, caravans crossed a landscape and left behind patches of shadow where trust had been eaten away. The Watchers instructed him about the ethics of exchange, that trade can be a blessing when it circulates care, and a bane when it concentrates advantage. Enoch's counsel began to include advice about fairness and the stewardship of resources. Not all counsel was public. In private, Enoch struggled with doubts that felt like weather, moving through days with alternations of clear and storm. Some nights he received no visions and felt severed from the thread, as if the stair had gone dim. Those absences were lessons in another faculty, endurance. The Watchers had said that a seer must survive silence because change is usually slow and the world often moves by inertia rather than design. He learned to continue tending, speaking, and waiting, trusting that service mattered even when visions paused. At times the dreams were prescriptive, offering detailed instruction: where to plant a tree, how to mediate a dispute, the right moment to build a well. Enoch found that action was the interpreter of dream. To dream without doing is vanity. He took up the prescribed tasks with a zeal tempered by care, and communities responded. Wells become places of diplomacy as much as water, orchards became meeting grounds, and repair of roofs became an exercise in renewing trust. Small infrastructure, he discovered, often carries the weight of social healing. There were also moments of private revelation that asked nothing of him but the humility of recognition. He learned of his own limits in visceral ways, how his endurance had edges and how his judgments could be clouded by personal grievance. The Watchers were not indulgent. They would show him a failing and ask him to work on it without mercy. Through repetitive exposure to his own flaws, he cultivated honesty, discovering that confession is not weakness but a practical technique for clearing the mind to see more accurately. One sequence of dreams led him to contemplate the aesthetics of justice. Justice, he was shown, has shape and rhythm. It is not merely an adjudication but a tuning of relationships. In a brilliant vision, scales were not the central metaphor but gardens, justice as tending, removing weeds of resentment, planting compensatory seeds, and designing layouts so everyone had sun. This reframing suited him. It allowed him to teach restorative practices that mended people rather than simply punishing wrongs. As he aged, the visions adapted. They began to carry a tone of mentorship, as if the Watchers were preparing him for an eventual transition. They showed him images of a younger listener who might carry on some of the tasks, scenes where the staircase slowly widened into a path shared by others. Enoch grew more deliberate in passing on what he had learned, telling stories out loud so they could be learned as rhythms rather than formulas. He turned the book of living ethics into a spoken curriculum of narratives that people could claim as their own. At the center of many dreams was the idea of accountability without annihilation. He was taught that to be held to account is not to be erased, rather, it is to be invited into fuller life. Enoch's counsel to those who feared judgment was this: to receive accountability as a form of precise, loving attention. The Watchers showed him models where truth-telling led to reintegration rather than exile, and he championed those models in his community. Enoch also saw the machinery of time in metaphorical detail. He witnessed a loom where moments were woven together with threads of intention and accident. Some threads were thick with purpose, others were thin and frayed, representing neglected responsibilities. The Watchers taught him to see which threads could be mended, which patterns had been woven too tightly, and where a deliberate cut could allow new things to grow. He gained a vocabulary of repair that was part craft, part ethic. The dreams did not always provide clear instruction about large political matters, but they gave him the moral compass to navigate them. He found ways to counsel tribal leaders to consider long-term stability over short-term gain, to advise merchants to account for the welfare of workers, and to remind judges to look beyond precedent to mercy. His influence thus moved from intimate interchanges to broader social currents. He never sought power. His aim was utility, the careful distribution of light in places of shadow. There came a time when Enoch was led, in a dream, to a house that contained rooms corresponding to emotions. Passing through them, he felt fear's cold, the bright ache of love, the slow density of grief. Each room left him with a practical task: to teach his community rituals for grief so the emotion could transform rather than calcify. Those rituals took simple forms: shared meals, spoken names, small markers of remembrance, and they became part of his practice as a counselor and convener. The Watchers emphasized the importance of naming. In one dream, a child asked, "Why must we name things?" And the Watchers replied by showing a nameless storm that left destruction worse because nobody could describe it. Names anchor attention, they attach responsibility. Enoch realized that to name a wrong is to begin the work of repair because once labeled, it can be tracked, addressed, and learned from. He encouraged his people to develop honesty in naming both harms and hopes. Sometimes the dreams were pedagogical through metaphor. He was shown the inner life of a river and learned about patience from the way it eroded stone and deposited silt. He received instruction about community from the manner in which reeds bent together against the current. These earthly metaphors made his teachings palpable. People remembered his advice because it was knitted to the world they touched every day. The vision of the ledger reappeared later with greater complexity. Now it contained not only human deeds but also their ripple effects across material systems, the way a decision to burn a forest complicated air and rain, the way civic kindness led to a later generosity from an unexpected corner. The Watchers insisted that Enoch must teach systems thinking in simple language. Small acts have system-wide consequences. He developed stories that illustrated these chains so people could grasp the interdependence without being overwhelmed. In one prolonged series of dreams, he was asked to consider the ethics of memory. The Watchers placed before him artifacts, knitted scarves, cracked bowls, a child's first shoe, and urged him to consider what objects remember about a life. Memory, they taught, lives not only in minds but in things. Enoch began encouraging rituals that respected artifacts, not out of superstition but as ways to keep histories alive and to maintain a community's long memory for what worked and what failed. As he matured, his understanding of mercy deepened. Mercy was not merely a gift from a powerful to a weaker one, but a structure of mutual support where the strong recognized their obligation to the fragile. In dreams where he sat at long tables with the Watchers, discussions of mercy were practical: how to set laws that protect without infantilizing, how to provide help that builds capacity, not dependency. There was a radical concern for autonomy balanced with compassion, an ethic of enabling so each person might come into their own. Some nights the cosmic perspective returned with a tenderness that softened the practical instruction. Enoch watched worlds being tended by hands that bore no resentment for human stubbornness. The Watchers showed infinite patience as they rearranged stars, as if even cosmic work proceeds with a slow, forgiving rhythm. This tenderness seeped into his preaching. He began to speak of godhood, or ultimate caretaking, as a steady gardener rather than a strict judge, urging his listeners to emulate that patience in their dealings with neighbors. Not all the Watchers' lessons were about communities or even ethics. Frequently they highlighted craft. They showed him how to weave more durable baskets, how to treat wood to resist rot, how to store grain so its life extended through lean seasons. Practical knowledge, the Watchers insisted, is holy insofar as it preserves life. Enoch embraced these crafts as indispensable parts of his teaching because the well-being of flesh depends on proper technique as much as on desire. Dreams sometimes offered paradoxes to be lived rather than solved. He was shown a fire that warmed people equally if they sat close, but when one person sought to possess the whole flame, the warmth died. The Watchers used this to teach about generosity and guardedness, that sharing amplifies resource, while hoarding diminishes it. Enoch's lessons on distribution and restraint were practical, arguing for communal structures that avoided both poverty and excess. As the years multiplied, so did the complexities he was asked to hold. The Watchers did not reduce the world to tidy moral signposts. Instead, they taught him how to engage complexity with nuance. He learned not to yield to binary thinking, and to resist the seduction of simplifying crises into villains and heroes. His narratives began to emphasize the messy truth that human beings are capable of both tenderness and harm, sometimes in the same breath. At times he was confronted with visions of leaders making choices under constraint, and he felt the ache of empathy for them. The Watchers taught that empathy does not require agreement with every decision, but it does require understanding the pressures leaders face. This tempered his counsel. He advocated for systems that reduced pressure, created transparency, and distributed authority so no single person bore insurmountable burden. The dreams made him a friend to both caution and courage. One dream lingered with him for weeks, a map folded into a child's hand, lines worn into it by constant reading. The map was partial, showing a network of safe paths and dangerous shoals. The child read the map out loud and, with the Watcher's guidance, taught others to read it too. Enoch realized that his responsibility was not to hold the map but to teach others how to navigate by its lines and how to redraw parts when the terrain changed. This underscored a pedagogical humility. Knowledge must be shared to be sustained. The Watchers sometimes enacted lessons through embodied drama. In one nocturne, they portrayed a village that gradually forgot how to mourn properly. Sorrow turned to anger and then to feuds. The villagers, freed from ritual, became more brittle and less forgiving. Enoch was shown how ritual scaffolds community, providing a container for emotional turbulence so relationships do not fracture. He brought these rituals back as small, repeatable acts: candles lit at evening, communal songs at harvest, names spoken at graves, and watched their restorative power. Dreams also taught him about silence as an ethical practice. The Watchers showed him that not everything needs a verdict and that sometimes the best response is to sit with a person until they find their own words. Silence, in their lessons, is active rather than empty. It is a holding space where grief, confusion, and revelation can settle. Enoch learned to cultivate silence in public gatherings and private counsel alike, and in that silence many found the courage to speak clearer truths. At a certain point, the visions introduced him to the motif of repair as a liturgy. He watched people mend clothes, fix broken pots, and reweave baskets, and each act of repair was accompanied by spoken acknowledgement and shared labor. Repair, he learned, is a moral technology. It restores not only objects but relationships. He taught communities to celebrate repair work, making mending parties where stories were exchanged and bonds reformed. The Watchers also delved into aesthetics. They redeemed beauty from mere decoration and made it a tool for moral education. Enoch was shown that the one who tends beauty in a place tends its soul, that murals and songs and well-crafted tools attract care. He began advocating for beauty in all communal spaces, arguing that a well-made bridge, a clean tavern, a thoughtfully placed bench are civic virtues because they encourage respect and stewardship. Sometimes the dreams were mercilessly clear. In one sequence, he watched the slow collapse of a city that had chosen efficiency over care, speed over listening. The efficiencies created systems that left no room for human repair, and the city eroded into brittle perfection. The Watchers used this as a cautionary tale. Systems that optimize for profit or speed at the expense of human dignity tend to implode. Enoch became an advocate for structural slowings, deliberate pauses built into economic and political processes so people can catch their bearings. There were nights when he was allowed to stand with the Watchers at thresholds between worlds and see glimpses of what lies beyond narrative. These glimpses were not meant to make him boastful or distant. They were given to ground his compassion in a sense of continuity. He experienced that ultimate continuity is less of a tidy endpoint and more of an extended conversation in which each life is a voice. This idea made his work urgent and tender. Every voice matters in the ongoing conversation of creation. Enoch's final decades were not quiet in the way solitude is quiet, but rich with the noise of communal life. His role shifted from sole interpreter to elder teacher, and he cultivated successors who could carry parts of the burden. He taught them how to read dreams as practical tools rather than esoteric spectacles, how to translate cosmic metaphors into domestic repairs, and how to create institutions small enough to adapt and large enough to hold people during crisis. The Watchers smiled in their dreams, approving the decentralization of responsibility. He found solace in small traditions passed from family to family, the way a father's laugh settles into a child's posture, or how a grandmother's stew recipe becomes a communal secret that nourishes more than hunger. Dream teachings had not made him indifferent to novelty. If anything, they increased his appetite for small, well-executed acts of love. He celebrated continuity that preserved room for innovation, knowing cultures survive by both remembering and reimagining. Toward the very end of his path, the Watchers endowed him with one final lesson about endings that softened his fear. They showed him how endings can be openings if attended with care, how a life concluded with reconciliation and attention becomes a seedbed for future flourishing. Enoch took this to heart and began to live the practice of ending. He visited those estranged and spoke the names of the dead to the young. He taught how to settle accounts not out of cold calculation but out of tenderness. His last years were, in that sense, a rehearsal for departure. People came to him as one comes to a sea for wisdom, seeking buoyancy in difficult tides, wanting an outline to orient their voyages. Enoch always answered with stories that were specific and humble. He refused to hand down simple formulas, preferring the slow logic of anecdote and repeated practice. His counsel was practical, fixated less on doctrine than on method: how to set a table so all who need may sit, how to record names so futures are accountable, how to repair a broken oath with ceremony and restitution. Dreams had taught him to refuse absolute certainty. He learned to say, "I do not know," gracefully, making space for shared inquiry rather than collapsing into the arrogance of false answers. This posture made his community resilient. People learned to collaborate in problem solving rather than waiting for a single sage. The Watchers favored this humility. They had never sought to create prophets who monopolize answers, but rather teachers who cultivate wise collectives. Ultimately, the waking and dreaming lives of Enoch braided into a single practice: attentiveness to consequence and stubborn devotion to repair. He became less of a mystical figure and more of a civic artisan, forging social tools that helped communities adapt, mourn, and rejoice. His legacy was not a manifesto but a set of living practices, rituals, gardens, wells, songs, that made moral attention habitual and beautiful. When the final dreams came, they were not dramatic revelations but a quiet folding inward. The stare of light reappeared, but this time it was populated with faces he knew, neighbors, infants he had blessed, elders he had tended. The Watchers looked on like proud teachers observing a student who has learned the subject well enough to teach others. Enoch felt no terror, only a steady warmth, as though life had been a long rhyme and the last couplet would land gently. He left instructions that were practical and precise: where to plant trees, how to mark certain days of remembrance, how to teach listening to children. He asked for no monuments, only that his name be used to bless work that helps people keep faith with one another. The Watcher's final counsel was the simplest: to attend to the small moral facts of life with the reverence one reserves for holy things. Even after he was gone, the practices he cultivated continued to propagate. Small circles of people met regularly to practice the rituals he taught, to tend repair parties, and to read aloud the living book of ethics he had compiled. Those gatherings created a slow culture of responsibility that resisted both cynicism and simplistic utopianism. The Watchers watched, pleased, as their lessons took root in human soil and learned to reproduce themselves through story and habit. In the end, the awakening of Enoch was less a sudden anointment and more a long apprenticeship to a way of seeing. The stare of light, the ledger of names, the river of vision, these were not theatrical trappings but devices to train attention. What he learned to do, above all, was to notice. He recognized that in noticing there is power, the power to repair, to reconnect, and to shape futures by small, persistent acts of care. The listeners who heard his stories later described them not as mere tales but as invitations. People in markets and fields began to speak of living with an eye for consequences, of making small promises and keeping them, of cultivating community rituals that made memory reliable. The ripples from his practices altered many lives. Where once petty grievance might have escalated, attention now often found its way to restoration. Where drought might have broken community, shared wells and bookkeeping sustained hope. Enoch's awakening teaches that revelation is not a one-off spectacle but an education in the art of living. He was transformed slowly, through countless nights of patient instruction and countless days of practice. His example suggests that the sacred is often woven into the ordinary and that the best spiritual training equips people with tools to repair what is broken. He became a kind of midwife to societal repair, helping births of kindness and accountability. Even now, in the quiet hours when listeners find themselves behind the wheel or stirring a pot and his story passes through their minds, there is a gentle prompting to look around and carry the practice of attention into the world. The watcher's voices, the stare of light, the ledger, all these images act like a moral language one can use in daily life. If the tale of Enoch leaves a single residue, it is this: the ordinary world is dense with possibility for repair, and each person can become a steward of consequence. So, if you find yourself thinking of Enoch tonight, remember that his awakening was not about being taken away from the world but about learning to see it with unwavering clarity. He learned to translate dreams into acts, cosmic metaphors into practical ceremonies, and esoteric visions into domestic ethics. It is a teaching that asks only for attention and small, steady acts of care. In that modest demand lies the power to reshape lives, neighborhoods, and, in time, the arc of generations. If Enoch's story makes you stop and look at the world a little differently, subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you feel that change more in the quiet moments that open your eyes or in the small acts that make the world gentler.